Hello, my dear friends. They smelled like corpses even though they were still alive. The smell wasn't from illness or death. It was the result of living day after day without washing, without wiping, without touching their bodies. They were afraid of water, afraid of being judged. So they just left things as they were. They used powder and perfume to cover it up, but it didn't work. Some fainted from the smell. Some ran away. Some were buried alive because everyone thought they were dead. Tonight, you'll get a glimpse into the real lives of Victorian women, where cleanliness was only a facade, but inside was the smell of corpses. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to open the door to a small Victorian bedroom, the first thing to notice would not be the furniture but the smell. It clung to the air, heavy and sour, coming from layers of fabric and the unwashed bodies beneath them. Many women did not wash their lower bodies for months, believing that cold water could destroy their ability to have children. It was a fear passed from mother to daughter, and in poor homes where superstition often replaced medicine, the idea became an unquestioned rule. What began as caution slowly turned into neglect, and what was neglected turned into decay that no one dared to speak of. They wore the same undergarments day after day. The fabric, once white, turned yellow and stiff from sweat and secretions. Washing clothes was difficult and costly. Water had to be carried, soap was expensive, and the weather was cold. The simplest choice was to hang the undergarments by the fire until they dried and wear them again. After a few days, the cloth hardened, stuck to the skin, and gave off a strong, sour odour. It is strange how something as simple as washing could become a forbidden act in a society that calls itself civilized. The belief that purity meant never touching the lower body made many women live in quiet suffering. In narrow houses, there was no privacy. A woman could not wash herself without being seen or questioned. The shame of being thought unclean for even trying kept them still. As days passed, irritation turned into rashes, and rashes turned into open sores. The pain was constant, but silence was easier. The smell, however, could not be hidden. It lingered in rooms, in fabric, in sheets, and even in the air around them. Servants noticed it first, but they stayed quiet. Husbands noticed next, and they pretended it was something else. For the working class, the problem was worse. Their clothes were heavier, their work dirtier, and their homes smaller. They sweated in layers of wool and cotton, then went to bed in the same garments. The lower body, trapped under fabric, stayed damp and warm. Bacteria grew easily, though no one knew the word for it then. The odour became part of life, like coal smoke or spoiled milk. No one questioned it. If it happened today, it would be like people refusing to bathe because they believed the shower could make them sick. What was once fear turned into habit, and habit became identity. The upper classes hid the same problem behind perfume and lace. They could afford scented powders and imported oils, yet few washed with water. Even queens were warned that bathing too often could weaken the body. They followed that advice with pride, thinking restraint was health. Their rooms smelled of roses and mildew, a mixture that clung to skin and silk. Beneath the layers, the result was no different from that of the poor. The illusion of refinement only made the truth harder to face. Doctors wrote about infections but could not speak openly. To suggest washing was to risk scandal. Women who tried were told they were indecent or immoral. Many accepted their pain as punishment for being female. The moral code of the time demanded silence. When a woman fainted or fell ill, it was blamed on nerves or weakness, never on the filth trapped under her clothing. It is difficult to believe how easily people accepted sickness when all it took to avoid it was water. Yet fear ruled over logic, and ignorance was called modesty. Inside homes, the air grew thick, fires burned low, and windows stayed closed to keep out the cold. Clothes hung from hooks, stiff and yellow at the edges. Bed sheets carried stains that no one mentioned. The smell became normal, so familiar that people no longer noticed it. When visitors entered, they turned their heads slightly, but politeness kept them quiet. For those who lived in it, the stench became part of their existence. Mothers taught daughters to avoid washing, warning them of unseen dangers. They told them water could make them ill, or worse, make them barren. The girls obeyed, too young to question. By the time they became women, the belief was already deep within them. It was easier to endure discomfort than to risk gossip. The cycle continued, turning fear into custom and custom into suffering. Even in hospitals, nurses avoided washing female patients below the waist unless absolutely necessary. Doctors preferred to treat symptoms rather than causes. The idea of cleansing that part of the body seemed improper. Women who complained of pain were given herbs or alcohol instead of soap and water. The body was seen as a vessel to endure, not something to care for. In letters from that time, a few women mentioned the smell. They wrote about it quietly, calling it a heaviness or an unpleasant odour. They had no words for infection or hygiene, only discomfort and shame. The body was a thing to hide, never to discuss. So they stayed silent, even when pain made walking difficult, even when their clothing stuck to open sores. By night, when they undressed, the fabric peeled away from the skin with a faint sound. The cold air touched the dampness beneath, and it stung. They wrapped themselves again by morning, carrying the same discomfort through the day. The stench grew stronger each week until it no longer surprised anyone. It was simply the scent of being alive as a woman in that time. The refusal to wash was not just a matter of dirt. It was a reflection of fear, shame, and ignorance that shaped their daily lives. It kept them from comfort and turned simple habits into suffering. They did not know that the body they tried to protect was the one they were slowly destroying. It is both sad and ironic that what they thought preserved purity only created decay. The fear of water became the quiet cause of pain that spread through homes and families. They lived with it, breathed it, and passed it on like an inheritance. When the fire burned low and silence filled the rooms, the air carried that familiar sourness that no perfume could hide. It was the mark of women who lived in fear of their own bodies. The smell was their secret, their burden, and their undoing. The women who never washed carried that odour as part of their lives, a quiet proof of how fear controlled them. Over time, they tried to hide it with whatever they could find in the markets. What they used to master smell only made everything worse. Victorian women often believed that water was more harmful than dirt. Instead of washing, they covered their bodies in layers of powder made from ground flowers, starch, or chalk. This practice, known as dry bathing, was seen as elegant and practical. To them, a pleasant scent meant cleanliness, even if the body beneath was never touched by water. The powders were poured into small porcelain boxes, brushed on the skin, and left there for days. It gave the illusion of freshness, but under those layers, sweat and oil kept building up. It is almost absurd that people could look at dust on their skin and call it purity. The habit was so common that the faint white haze of powder became a mark of refinement. In small houses, women performed their daily baths by the firelight. A handful of scented powder was rubbed over the neck, arms, and chest. The smell was strong at first, floral and sweet, but by evening it mixed with the odour of sweat, smoke, and oil lamps. The same hands that cooked and cleaned were the ones that spread the powder. There was no thought of rinsing or scrubbing. The result was a sticky film that clung to everything. The fabric of the dresses absorbed it, turning darker near the waist and underarms. Beneath corsets and petticoats, the body baked slowly in its own residue. The wealthier families used imported powders from France, These came in fancy tins with painted labels, promising beauty and grace. For them, bathing with water was unfashionable. It was something for servants, not ladies. Instead, they sat at dressing tables, patting their skin until it looked matte and pale. The sweet scent filled the room, but the air soon turned heavy. As days went by, the perfume grew bitter, the powders trapped dirt, and the skin underneath began to itch. If this happened today, it would be like replacing a shower with deodorant spray and calling it Hygiene. For poorer women, powders were made at home. Crushed petals, ground chalk, or leftover starch were mixed together. Some even added candle wax to hold the scent longer. When spread on the body, it left patches of greyish residue. The smell of these homemade mixtures was far from pleasant. The powder absorbed sweat and turned to paste under layers of clothing. It stuck to the thighs, chest, and back until it hardened. Washing it off would have taken hours, and most never tried. As the day ended, the combination of scents in a Victorian home was overwhelming. The air carried the sweetness of powder, the smoke of candles, the grease of cooking, and the sourness of unwashed bodies. No one called it foul, they called it familiar. In diaries, women described pleasant evenings by the fire without mentioning the haze that filled the air. Their sense of cleanliness depended on what they could smell, not what they could see. The stronger the perfume, the cleaner they believed they were. Doctors occasionally warned about skin rashes caused by these powders, but few listened. Clean skin was pale, and pale skin required covering. The idea that washing could remove the natural oils of the body made many fear water even more. So, the routine continued. Each morning began with powder, and each night ended with the same layers still in place. The sheets absorbed it, and the smell of powder mixed with sweat became part of sleep itself. It is unsettling how comfort can be built on misunderstanding. Men, too, were used to this world of mixed odours. In crowded ballrooms, the scent of women's perfume clashed with candle smoke and the sharp tang of alcohol. The heat of the room made the powders melt, and streaks formed along the neck and chest. Fans fluttered, lace moved, and under the glamour, everyone smelled of decay. It was a public secret, a shared lie of elegance. Those who could afford more perfume were thought cleaner, even when their bodies told another story. In working-class areas, the habit took on a different form. Candles made of animal fat burned all day, releasing a greasy odour that mixed with powder. The result was a scent that clung to every surface. Even clean sheets smelled used within a few hours. The line between personal odour and the air of the house disappeared completely. For many, there was no separation between body and home. Both were soaked in the same mixture of stale air and powder. Children grew up in that smell. They watched their mothers dust themselves with powders instead of water. To them, that was what adults did. The skin that never breathed properly turned dull and rough. Small cracks formed on the surface, especially on hands and necks. Some women used even more powder to cover the marks, starting another layer on top of the old one. Over time, the body seemed less alive, as if it were being buried slowly under its own covering. By the end of the day, the scent of powder no longer masked the truth. It became part of it. The room smelled like closed jars, the air heavy and unmoving. The body underneath all that powder was tired, sticky, and suffocating. The illusion of beauty cost comfort, and the search for modesty led to quiet decay. The candles burned low, adding another thin layer of smoke to the skin that would never be cleaned. Many believed they were protecting their health by avoiding cold water. In truth, they were sealing in everything their bodies tried to release. The powders filled every pore and trapped the sweat beneath, turning cleanliness into an imitation. They thought they were preserving dignity, but all they preserved was the smell of stagnation. The women who avoided water carried a false sense of purity. Their skin looked pale under candlelight, but up close, it was coated and lifeless. The more powder they used, the further they drifted from true cleanliness. It was not vanity that ruined them, but ignorance passed off as grace. The scent of their bodies was a mixture of flowers, smoke, and rot. It marked every house, every dress, every bed. The effort to smell clean only made the filth harder to escape. It was a perfume that betrayed its purpose, a mask that could never hide the truth beneath. Their dry baths made them believe they were untouched by dirt, but they were only spreading it more evenly across their bodies. In every sense, they carried the proof of a time when appearance mattered more than health. The air itself became part of their disguise, thick, perfumed, and impossible to breathe. They thought the powders kept them pure, but purity never smelled like that. The scent of false cleanliness stayed long after the candles died out, lingering in the fabrics of a world too afraid to face its own body. The room was silent, but the smell told everything. The women who replaced water with powder traded one discomfort for another. Their bodies became softer in sight but harder to live in. Under their dresses, Victorian women wore cotton undergarments that rarely left their bodies. These garments were meant to protect the outer layers from sweat and oil, yet they were almost never changed. A single piece could be worn for days, sometimes weeks, until the fabric stiffened with moisture. The heat trapped under corsets and bodices made the cloth cling tightly to the skin. When it dried, it hardened, then softened again as the body warmed. It became part of them, like a second layer of skin that carried its own smell. It is almost ridiculous to think that the same people who feared dirt on their shoes lived comfortably inside clothes soaked with sweat. Laundry was not simple work. Water had to be carried in buckets, boiled, and mixed with soap flakes that cost more than food. Women saved washing for Sundays or special occasions, not for daily wear. So, the undergarments remained. At first, the smell was faint, like damp cloth left too long near a fire. Then it grew sharper, turning sour with each passing day. The acid from the sweat broke down the fibres and began to irritate the skin. Under the arms and around the waist, the contact points turned red. When the redness cracked, it bled. Many women used handkerchiefs or scarves to cover the stains left behind. They told themselves that modesty required endurance, not comfort. Even when the pain spread across the back and shoulders, they stayed silent. The corset hid everything, pressing fabric against wounds that needed air. By evening, the pain was dull but constant, and sleep brought no relief. The sheets stuck to their skin, and the smell filled the small rooms in crowded cities. The dampness of sweat met the soot of coal and the grease of cooking. The result was a scent that clung to everybody who passed through narrow streets. Perfume could not fight it. It only made the air heavier. If it happened today, it would be like wearing the same gym clothes for a week and calling it normal. For them, the smell of sweat was not shameful. It was ordinary. The body was not meant to be refreshed. It was meant to endure. For the poor, washing even one shirt meant choosing between soap and supper. Cotton was expensive, and most owned only a few garments. They hung the same pieces by the window each night, hoping the air would dry them enough to wear again. When the sun returned, so did the smell. The cloth never felt clean again. It carried the memory of every hour worked, every meal cooked, every drop of sweat. Wealthier women faced the same problem, though they hid it better. Their undergarments were finer, made from imported cotton or linen, but they were worn the same way. The dresses above were too tight, too heavy, and too complex to remove often. Changing clothes meant loosening corsets, unfastening hooks, and asking for help from servants. It was easier to pretend that everything underneath was still fresh. Beneath layers of silk, the body rotted slowly in silence. Some tried sprinkling powder or vinegar under their arms to keep odours away. These quick fixes stung the skin but provided little relief. The powder mixed with sweat and turned to paste, rubbing against the flesh until it burned. The vinegar left marks that looked like bruises. Still, women continued, afraid of gossip more than pain. They believed that speaking of sweat was indecent. The result was a quiet suffering no one named. Doctors called it skin fatigue, though the term hardly covered the truth. In letters and reports, they described rashes, sores, and raw patches of flesh under corsets and sleeves. Some women developed abscesses that oozed through their clothing. When treated, the smell was described as metallic and sour, a sign of infection, but these were private illnesses hidden under lace and ribbon. Society demanded elegance, and elegance required silence. In the heat of summer, the problem worsened. The air in houses turned damp, and clothes never dried fully. The mixture of sweat, starch, and perfume created a dense odour that spread from room to room. Servants cleaning the laundry sometimes fainted from the smell. Still, no one questioned the system. To complain was to appear ungrateful, to admit weakness, to be less than proper. It is hard not to feel pity for women who thought suffering quietly made them respectable. Evening routines offered no escape. The garments were hung by the fire to dry, but the warmth only baked in the smell. Some women placed scented sachets between layers of fabric, hoping to trick their senses. The result was worse. The sweet smell of flowers mixed with the sourness of sweat, forming a scent that was impossible to forget. It stayed on their skin, in their hair, even in their breath. By the end of the week, the fabric had turned rough and grey. The once soft cotton rubbed against the skin like sandpaper, yet they kept wearing it, because replacing it meant admitting it was dirty. Admitting that meant admitting the body itself was dirty, and that was something many could not bear. The women who lived this way believed that patience and endurance were virtues. The pain under their clothes was a secret kind of discipline. They thought they were preserving dignity, but what they preserved was infection and decay. Each morning, they dressed in what hurt them, telling themselves it was proper. The smell that rose from their undergarments was not only a sign of dirt, it was a sign of silence. It showed how far they would go to protect appearances. It clung to their bodies, their homes, and their idea of virtue. It was the odour of a world that punished women for being human. They wore their pain under cotton and called it grace. The stains, the sores, the smell, all hidden under ribbons and fabric meant to impress others. The price of decency was written on their skin, where no one cared to look. The women who refused to change their garments carried the proof of their suffering with them. Beneath each layer was a quiet war between body and belief, and what they began doing to disguise the smell would turn that war into something far more dangerous. Medical notes from the Victorian era often spoke quietly about smells that no one else dared to describe. In the lower districts, women who had gone months without washing carried an odour that doctors struggled to define. Some called it a living decay, others simply wrote that it resembled vinegar and rot. The air around them was thick, a mixture of damp fabric, old sweat, and infection trapped under layers of cotton. It was not a single smell, but many: stale water, spoiled milk, something sour and metallic that lingered in every breath. It is disturbing how an entire society learned to live with the scent of its own neglect. Women themselves could no longer tell when the smell began or ended. It was part of their homes, their clothes, their daily existence. The body adapted to the odour until it stopped noticing it. But men noticed. Servants whispered about rooms they avoided, about bedsheets that smelled stronger than any chamber pot. Husbands blamed the air, the drains, even the weather. Refusing to admit the cause lay closer. When some fainted from the stench, it was easier to pretend it came from spoiled food than from the woman beside them. Doctors who treated infections described a kind of slow rot that began between the legs and spread upward. The skin turned red, then grey, then soft like wet paper. Some cases were so advanced that even gentle movement caused bleeding. They compared the smell to fermented meat or pickled organs. It filled the examination rooms and clung to the walls long after patients had left. There was no disinfectant strong enough to erase it. Many doctors performed their work with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, their notes written quickly, their words careful. Among the poor, this condition was common. Lack of water, ignorance, and fear created the perfect environment for infection. Women wore the same soiled cloths day after day, letting secretions build until they burned the skin. Each movement released more odour. It was not only a sign of sickness, but also of survival. Washing could mean exposure to cold, and cold meant illness or death. So they endured. If this happened today, it would be like living beside an open sewer and pretending it was perfume. Those who worked in close quarters, laundresses, seamstresses, factory women suffered most. The heat and confinement turned their clothes into traps for bacteria. The smell followed them everywhere, thickening when they gathered in groups. Some employers dismissed them for it, claiming they offended the air. Others ignored it because it was too common to fix. In crowded workrooms, the scent of decay mixed with steam from the irons and dust from the cloth. It was a stench that belonged to labour itself. Even among upper-class women, hidden beneath lace and perfume, the problem remained. Their bodies were bound tightly in corsets, their undergarments layered and sealed. The warmth beneath all that fabric turned sweat into breeding grounds for infection. The difference was that the rich could cover it. They masked the smell with rosewater and musk, creating a sweeter form of decay. At social gatherings, rooms were filled with these overlapping scents: flowers, wax, rot, none of them clean. The illusion of refinement made it worse because no one dared to speak. In the winter months, the problem became unbearable. Cold air stopped women from washing entirely. Weeks passed before water touched their skin. Doctors wrote that some infections ate through flesh as if it were soft fruit. The smell of those cases was recorded as enough to drive attendants from the room. Yet the women themselves sat quietly, faces pale, hands folded, waiting for treatment that rarely came. Pain was considered natural, and the odour was simply fate. Men, confronted with it, often reacted with disgust rather than concern. Some fainted or vomited, unable to tolerate the smell. Others blamed the women, claiming they were cursed or unclean by nature. It was easier for them to condemn than to understand. In truth, the women were victims of a system that taught them to fear their own bodies. They were told to avoid water, to hide pain, to value modesty over health. The result was this: the body turning against itself while the world looked away. In homes where illness had taken hold, the air turned heavy, curtains absorbed the scent, and bedsheets stayed damp from sweat. Candles only added to the mixture, their smoke clinging to everything. Visitors left quickly, pretending not to notice. The women stayed in bed, too weak to rise, surrounded by the odour of their own suffering. It is hard to imagine a time when the smell of sickness could fill a house and still be called normal. Even those who survived carried the scent with them for years. It was in their clothes, their hair, their skin. They tried to cover it with powders or vinegar, but these only deepened the stench. The body had become a vessel of infection, and there was no escape. Every attempt to cleanse it without water made it worse. What had started as fear of cold ended in the slow destruction of flesh. The phrase living decay was not poetic. It was exact. The body did not die quickly. It rotted in pieces while the heart kept beating. The women endured it silently, believing that this was the price of being respectable. They did not know that respectability was killing them one day at a time. The stench that filled those rooms was more than the smell of sickness. It was the proof of ignorance, of poverty, of the cruelty hidden behind polite manners. It showed how deeply society could lie to itself about what was pure and what was foul. The women who carried that odour did not choose it. They were shaped by fear, by cold, by rules that punished them for existing. The air around them was thick with everything they had been taught to suppress. Their silence became the final layer over their bodies, sealing the truth beneath it. The memory of that stench lingered in hospitals, homes, and alleyways. It told the story of bodies left to rot under the weight of false virtue. No candle, no perfume, no prayer could make it disappear. The women whose bodies began to decay alive were not yet at the worst of it. As they tried to rid themselves of the odour, their desperate solutions only opened new wounds that smelled even stronger than before. Public bathhouses in Victorian towns were rare and poorly maintained. Most were built not for comfort but for necessity. Dark places filled with steam and the faint smell of soap long past its strength. Women who could not afford private washing came here to feel at least a hint of cleanliness. Inside, there were only a few towels for everyone. They were hung along damp walls, stiff from use, drying in air that never truly felt clean. By evening, the same towels would be passed again from hand to hand. It is strange how people could think cleanliness meant touching what had already been touched by so many others. The floors were always wet, the water grey from countless rinses. Buckets were refilled without being emptied, and the same basin served dozens of women. Some brought their children, others came alone, carrying small cakes of soap wrapped in cloth. There was no privacy, only quick movements and lowered eyes. The women washed as best they could, wiping themselves dry with towels that had already been used that morning. The fabric felt rough, heavy with moisture, smelling of sweat and mildew. No one questioned it. There were too few towels to do otherwise, and bringing your own was seen as an unnecessary luxury. Attendants rarely cleaned them. After each group left, the towels were hung near the stove to dry, but the heat only baked the smell into the fibres. By the next day, they were stiff again, still marked by the bodies that had touched them before. The mixture of soap, damp skin, and mould filled the entire room. If this happened today, it would be like sharing the same towel with strangers in a public restroom and calling it hygiene. For many women, this was their only chance to wash. The bathhouses opened for a few hours each week, and crowds gathered early. Lines formed outside the doors, where the air already carried the scent of the baths. Inside, the noise was constant. The splash of water, the scrape of basins, the whispers of exhaustion. Towels were passed around like rags, sometimes torn, sometimes damp with someone else's sweat. No one had the strength to complain. Poverty taught people to accept what they were given. Doctors later wrote about outbreaks of infection traced to public bathhouses. Women left cleaner in appearance but carrying sicknesses they did not have before. Rashes, sores, and burning pain began within days. Few realized the cause was something as simple as a towel. To them, sickness was just another part of life, something that arrived and left without warning. They had no reason to suspect the very place meant to cleanse them was what poisoned them. In small towns, the situation was worse. Bathhouses were converted from old stables or sheds. Towels hung beside buckets of cold water, and rats ran beneath the benches. Women still came, grateful for the chance to wash even a little. The idea of sharing did not seem strange anymore. They had shared everything else: beds, rooms, air. So sharing towels felt natural. It is unsettling how easily filth can disguise itself as care when people have nothing left. Among the poor, the bathhouses also served as gathering places. Women exchanged gossip while washing, traded scraps of soap, and offered advice on how to stretch a towel to last longer. They talked about illnesses in hushed tones, not realizing they all carried the same ones. A single piece of cloth could move through 10 pairs of hands in an hour. Each use spread whatever lingered on the surface to the next body that touched it. Attendants were often young girls who worked for food, not wages. Their task was to collect the towels, wring them out, and hang them back up. They did not know about germs, only smell. When the odour grew too strong, they sprinkled vinegar or powder on the cloth. This only made things worse. The acids in the vinegar irritated the skin, and the powders trapped moisture. The towels looked cleaner but carried more bacteria than before. Wealthier districts had bathhouses too, but even there the practice was similar. Linen towels were shared among guests, perfumed lightly to mask the odour. The difference was only in scent, not in hygiene. Servants collected the used ones, rinsed them quickly, and laid them out again for the next group. The illusion of order gave comfort, but the risk remained the same. Behind the polished walls, the same diseases passed quietly from one person to another. Some women brought home infections they did not understand. Burning sensations, strange discharges, and pain when walking were common. They hid these symptoms in shame, believing they had done something wrong. Husbands blamed them, calling them unclean. No one thought to blame the towel. Doctors could do little. Without antibiotics or understanding, the infection spread unchecked, shaping the health of entire communities. The smell of these bathhouses lingered in the streets outside. It mixed with coal smoke and the sourness of the river nearby. Even from a distance, one could tell when the doors had been opened. The air that rushed out was thick, carrying both steam and decay. For some, it was a smell of relief. For others, it was the scent of sickness returning home. By the time the women reached their houses, their skin felt dry but unclean. The towels had removed the surface dirt but left behind something invisible. The next time they came, the same towels waited again, hanging limp and grey. The cycle never ended. It was a ritual of cleansing that only spread more filth. The idea of shared cleanliness made sense in a world where personal space did not exist. Poverty forced people together, and necessity made them believe it was safe. No one wanted to imagine that what felt like cleanliness was only disease in disguise. The women who wiped their bodies with those shared towels carried home more than the memory of the bathhouse. They carried the beginnings of infections that would last for years. Their search for purity only pulled them deeper into sickness, proving again that in the Victorian world, even attempts at cleanliness could destroy the body. Their relief after bathing was only an illusion. The scent of soap quickly faded, replaced by something far less forgiving. What they thought was a small escape from filth became another trap that waited for them each week. Victorian women often believed that beauty could be maintained through pain. When the smell of their bodies became too strong to hide, many turned to camphor, a substance used to repel insects and preserve fabrics. It was sold in small white crystals, sharp in scent and cold to the touch. Women wrapped bits of it in cloth, sometimes mixing it with flower petals, and placed it inside their undergarments to mask odour. The result was immediate and deceptive. The harsh fragrance covered the smell, but it also burned the skin beneath. It is bitterly ironic how something meant to keep them clean instead scorched them like fire. Camphor was cheap and easy to find. Apothecaries sold it beside soap and perfumes, promising freshness and purity. No one warned of its dangers. When pressed against warm flesh, the substance released a strong vapour that caused stinging, redness, and eventually blistering. Women accepted the discomfort as proof that it worked. In a world that praised restraint, pain was mistaken for discipline. The more it hurt, the purer they felt. Inside cramped homes, the smell of camphor spread quickly. It mixed with sweat, smoke, and mildew, creating a scent both medicinal and suffocating. Families grew used to it. To them, it was the smell of decency, not damage. Some women added rose petals to soften the scent, but the combination only made it stranger. Beneath their dresses, the camphor packets shifted as they walked, rubbing against the skin until it blistered. When the pain became too sharp, they replaced the fabric with a new one and began again. Doctors noticed burns but rarely asked about their cause. Modesty prevented women from speaking of what they placed inside their garments. When treated, the wounds were described as raw, circular patches along the thighs and lower abdomen. Some doctors called it camphor dermatitis, though few made the connection between cleanliness and injury. If something similar happened today, it would be like spraying disinfectant directly onto the skin and believing it was self-care. The ignorance was deep, but it was also taught. Camphor had long been associated with purity. In churches, it was burned with incense. In homes, It was kept in closets to ward off decay. Women saw it as a symbol of protection. If it could keep clothing fresh, surely it could keep the body pure. This belief made the practice spread quickly, especially among the poor, who could not afford perfumes or powders. The sharp, almost mint-like smell became the scent of modesty itself. In summer, when the heat made odours stronger, the use of camphor increased. Women carried small sachets in their pockets and replaced them daily. The constant contact caused swelling and sores that often bled, but rather than stopping, many believed the pain meant the camphor was drawing out impurities. Some even applied crushed crystals directly onto the skin for a stronger effect. They endured the sting in silence, fearing judgment more than injury. The upper class adopted the habit as well, though with more elegance. Their camphor was mixed with lavender oil and wrapped in silk. It was placed discreetly between layers of undergarments. Servants changed these packets without question. The women felt safer knowing their bodies smelled of flowers and medicine rather than sweat. The burns they suffered were hidden, their discomfort considered private. Behind closed doors, they applied soothing ointments, then replaced the same harmful remedy the next morning. It is unsettling how pain became part of refinement, as if suffering itself could make someone graceful. Reports of severe burns appeared occasionally in medical journals. Some cases mentioned tissue so damaged that the skin peeled away, leaving open wounds. A few women developed infections that spread into deeper layers of flesh. Without antibiotics, recovery was slow and agonizing. Yet even these stories failed to stop others. The fear of being thought unclean outweighed the fear of pain. In their minds, appearance always came first. The smell of camphor became a mark of social respectability. It filled carriages, drawing rooms, and even theatres. Men described it as a clean scent, unaware of the suffering it concealed. The women sat quietly beside them, their movements careful, their expressions calm, even as the burns beneath their clothes throbbed with each breath. They had learned to sit through pain as if it were part of being alive. In homes where water was scarce and soap expensive, camphor felt like a miracle. It required no effort, no washing, only endurance. Mothers taught daughters how to prepare the packets, passing down the habit as a form of care. They believed they were protecting them, not realizing they were handing over the same cycle of injury and silence. The sharp scent that once meant cleanliness became the background of their lives, something they no longer noticed. By night, the air in their rooms carried that strong, medicinal odour. It was sharp enough to sting the eyes, heavy enough to linger on curtains and sheets. They lay still, trying not to move, aware that any friction would make the pain worse. Yet they found comfort in the thought that they smelled proper, that their bodies would not offend anyone. The ache became part of their sleep, and the scent became part of their dreams. The burns healed slowly, leaving pale scars that never fully disappeared. For some, the tissue hardened, making even walking painful. Still, they continued, convinced that beauty demanded sacrifice. In their silence, the line between care and harm vanished completely. The women who used camphor thought they were preserving dignity, but what they preserved was pain. Their faith in scent blinded them to the damage beneath. The sharpness of camphor became the fragrance of suffering, spreading through homes like invisible smoke. They believed the burning meant purity, yet it only marked the body with quiet wounds no one saw. As the air filled with the scent of their endurance, they began searching for something stronger, something that promised to cleanse what camphor could not. Victorian women often turned to the strongest things they could find when the smell of their bodies became too heavy to ignore. Alcohol was one of them. Bottles of gin and whiskey sat in many homes, used not only for drinking but for cleaning wounds, removing stains, and for some, wiping their own flesh. They soaked bits of fabric in the liquid and rubbed it over their skin, believing that the sharp sting meant it was working. The first touch burned like fire. The second brought numbness, and after that came only dryness. It is unsettling to think that a drink once used to dull sorrow became a tool for cleansing pain. The idea seemed practical. Water was cold and scarce, but alcohol felt warm and strong. It evaporated quickly, leaving behind a faint smell of spirits that seemed fresher than sweat. Women were told it could kill odours and protect against infection. No one warned them what it would do to their skin. The delicate tissue dried, cracked, and bled. Each time they repeated the process, the burning grew worse, yet the desire to feel clean was stronger than the pain. In small rooms where candles burned low, the smell of gin mixed with the air. It clung to fabrics, to sheets, to the hands that poured it. The same bottle used for wiping the body might also serve for rinsing cups or flavouring medicine. Everything smelled faintly of alcohol, sharp and sour. The women thought it made them pure. If it happened today, it would be like using industrial cleaner instead of soap, just because it feels stronger. To them, harshness meant effectiveness. The poorest women used whatever was available. Cheap gin was common, sometimes mixed with other spirits or spoiled wine. They soaked torn cloths and wiped themselves quickly, afraid of being seen. The sting was immediate. The alcohol stripped away moisture, leaving the skin dry as bark. After a few days, rashes appeared. Soon the flesh cracked open, and every movement became painful. But they continued, thinking the discomfort meant the dirt was gone. Some added herbs or perfume to soften the smell, but these only made the mixture more irritating. The alcohol carried the oils deeper into the tissue, inflaming everything it touched. The pain that followed was described in diaries as a cleansing ache, a phrase that showed how much they misunderstood their own suffering. Doctors treated many women for what they called female inflammation, prescribing more alcohol to disinfect the wounds, making things even worse. Among wealthier women, whiskey was preferred. It was considered gentler and more refined. They soaked fine cloths in it, patting the skin delicately rather than scrubbing. Servants prepared these cloths in small bowls lined with lace. The smell filled the bedrooms, sharp and sweet at once. Under candlelight, it seemed almost elegant. Yet the results were the same: dryness, pain, and cracks that refused to heal. They called it refreshing, unaware that the alcohol was destroying the protective layers of their skin. The burns left behind were not like those from heat. They were slow and silent. The outer layer hardened, while the flesh beneath stayed sore. Each trip to the toilet became a test of endurance. Sitting hurt, walking hurt, and washing with anything but alcohol felt impossible. The women who suffered most were the ones who believed most strongly in propriety. Cleanliness, for them, was not comfort but duty. The smell of spirits lingered wherever they went. It followed them into parlours, churches, and carriages. Men found it pleasant, associating it with perfume or medicine. They did not know it came from wounds hidden beneath layers of fabric. The scent became a secret code among women, sharp, faint, familiar. They recognized it in one another and said nothing. Silence kept them respectable. Over time, their skin toughened. The constant exposure made it leathery and pale. Some developed scabs that never healed properly, while others suffered infections that spread deeper. When doctors examined them, they found the tissue white and dry, as if aged before its time. The women listened to advice quietly and went home to do the same thing again. Pain was private, and modesty meant never admitting what hurt. In homes where gin was used this way, children grew up thinking it was normal. They watched their mothers wipe themselves with alcohol, believing it to be a kind of medicine. When they grew older, they repeated the same ritual. It became part of womanhood, something done quietly and without question. The smell of spirits became part of daily life, mingling with cooking smoke and candle wax. By night, when the house was silent, the scent of alcohol drifted through the rooms. It was sharp but strangely comforting, a sign that someone had tried to stay clean in a world that offered no other way. The skin beneath the fabric throbbed, and the air around the body felt tight. Sleep brought little rest. Every movement reopened the small cracks that lined the skin. Still, they endured it, because pain had become the proof of purity. When the dryness grew worse, some women applied more alcohol to soothe it, not realizing they were deepening their wounds. The cycle never ended. What they thought was healing was only further damage. They carried the marks for years, small white scars hidden where no one could see. The women who used gin and whiskey on their bodies thought they were purifying themselves. In truth, they were preserving the very suffering they hoped to escape. The scent of spirits lingered like a confession in the air, sharp, sad, and unspoken. Their effort to stay clean left them trapped in a circle of burning and pain. What began as a search for relief became a quiet destruction. And as the smell of alcohol faded, they found new ways to cover what water had never washed away. The stories written by midwives in old hospital records were not meant to shock, yet they did. In quiet handwriting, they described women who arrived in labour after years without washing. Their bodies had been covered, hidden, and ignored for so long that the flesh itself began to change. When the moment of birth came, what should have been a living passage was dark and deadened. The midwives wrote of tissue that looked grey, soft, and lifeless, as if the body had forgotten it belonged to someone alive. It is frightening to think that neglect could turn the body into something halfway between life and decay. The cause was simple: no water, no air, and no understanding. Many women had been taught never to clean that part of themselves. Some believed washing would bring infertility or illness. Others thought it was shameful to even look. Over the years, secretions and infections hardened inside them, forming layers of rot that no one saw. By the time childbirth forced everything open, what emerged was not just a child, but the evidence of years of silent destruction. Midwives were often the first to witness it. They worked in dimly lit rooms, surrounded by the smell of sweat, candle wax, and something heavier that never left the air. The moment the women spread their legs, the stench filled the room. Some midwives gagged, others forced themselves to continue. They had seen filth before, but this was something worse. One described it as the scent of a grave. Another wrote that the flesh was too dark to tell where the wound began. The women in these cases were not careless. They were obedient. They followed rules written by men who told them cleanliness was dangerous. The result was years of build-up thick, infected tissue that turned black from lack of care. Each attempt to move or breathe sent pain radiating through the abdomen, and yet they said nothing, believing pain was natural, part of being a woman. If such a thing happened today, it would be like living with an untreated wound for years and calling it modesty. When labour began, the pain doubled. The pressure of childbirth tore through tissue already half rotten. The air that entered the body brought infection deeper. Many died within days from fever and blood poisoning. The few who survived were left with wounds that never fully healed. Their bodies leaked pus and fluid for weeks, and the smell clung to everything they touched. In the small rooms where they gave birth, windows stayed closed, trapping the heat and odour together until the midwives could barely breathe. Those who lived in poor neighbourhoods suffered most. Baths were a luxury, and privacy did not exist. A woman could not wash without being seen, so she simply never did. Her undergarments soaked up everything, and over time, the moisture turned corrosive. The flesh beneath began to break down. It hardened in some places and softened in others, until the normal texture of skin disappeared. Midwives described it as like paper left too long in water. Among wealthier women, the problem was hidden more carefully. They perfumed their bodies, powdered themselves daily, and wore fine fabrics that trapped warmth. Beneath the lace and silk, infection thrived just the same. Doctors attending their births often wrote of a foul and unnatural odour. The cause was the same as among the poor, neglect disguised as virtue. It is tragic how both poverty and pride could lead to the same kind of decay. After birth, many of these women developed fever and delirium. Their wombs were filled with dead tissue that could not expel itself. The pain was unbearable, but speaking of it was worse. To admit illness in that part of the body invited shame. So they endured quietly, lying in dark rooms that smelled of medicine and rot. Some were treated with vinegar, others with alcohol, which only deepened the wounds. Midwives washed what they could, but their efforts came too late. The hospitals of that time were filled with these women. The air was thick with the scent of blood and infection. Sheets were rarely changed, instruments rarely cleaned. Midwives had little choice but to reuse the same towels from one patient to another. What began as one woman's decay soon spread to others. In the wards, the line between patient and corpse blurred. Those who witnessed it often wrote about the silence. The women did not scream much. They were too weak. Their eyes stayed open, fixed on nothing, as if they were already gone. For midwives, the hardest part was not the sight but the smell. It stayed on their clothes for days. Even after washing their hands, they said it lingered under their nails. The cycle continued for decades. New mothers taught their daughters the same fears. Each generation learned to avoid water, to stay silent, to accept pain as normal. The result was generations of women carrying the same hidden wounds. It was not just their bodies that suffered, but their sense of what life was meant to be. They thought endurance was a virtue when in truth it was submission to ignorance. By the late Victorian period, a few doctors began to question the cause of these deaths. They spoke of hygiene, of washing, of clean tools and fresh air. But old beliefs died slowly. Many women still feared that washing after childbirth would make them bleed or weaken their wombs. The few who dared to change were called reckless, even immoral. The stories left behind by midwives were never meant for the public. They were written for records, not readers, yet they remain the clearest glimpse into what silence can do to the body. The pages describe pain that could have been avoided, death that could have been prevented, and a smell that no one forgot. These women did not die from childbirth alone. They died from the weight of their own obedience, from years of being told that cleanliness was sin and pain was virtue. Their bodies carried the proof until the very end. The reports of decayed wombs and lifeless flesh were not isolated cases. They were a quiet epidemic, spreading through homes and hospitals alike. For the women who lived long enough to tell their stories, survival was not a blessing. It was a slow reminder of what neglect could do. The women who rotted from within were not victims of fate, but of fear. Their bodies became monuments to ignorance, preserved in the words of those who tried too late to save them. The truth lay there, in the smell, the silence, and the shame that no one dared to name. The sight of their decay left midwives shaken for life. Some said they could never eat meat again, and others left the profession altogether. The memory stayed with them like a shadow, proof of how the absence of simple care could destroy everything. Their bodies had decayed while still breathing, yet even that horror was not enough to end the habits that caused it. Soon, the search for purity would drive women toward other methods, ones that burned, poisoned, and scarred them in ways even more painful than before. Menstruation was one of the most difficult parts of life for Victorian women, not because it was rare or misunderstood, but because no one talked about it. In homes where water was scarce and soap expensive, they made do with strips of old cloth folded into layers and tied in place with thin cords. The fabric was never thick enough. With each movement, the blood seeped through and spread to the heavy dresses they wore. The dark colours of their skirts helped to hide the stains, but the smell told the truth. It is disturbing how silence turned a simple natural process into a source of constant humiliation. The air in their homes was often filled with a faint sourness, a mix of sweat, iron, and decay. Women tried to wash the clothes by hand, but the stains never left completely. Water was cold, and washing something so private risked judgment if seen by others. Some hung the cloths by the fire to dry. turning the air thick with the metallic scent of blood. When reused, the fabric felt stiff, rubbing painfully against the skin. They continued to use it until it tore. There was no alternative. During the heaviest days, they placed extra layers beneath them, sitting carefully to avoid making a mess. Still, when they rose, the seats bore dark marks. In silence, they wiped them away before anyone noticed. The sound of fabric separating from the chair made a faint sticky noise that they all recognized. They felt it every month, a quiet reminder that their bodies did not fit the rules of cleanliness society demanded. If such a thing happened today, it would be like using a dishcloth instead of a sanitary pad and calling it resourcefulness. The discomfort was constant, blood mixed with sweat and discharge, creating a glue-like texture that clung to the thighs. When it dried, it pulled at the skin. Many developed rashes and sores that burned with every step. Doctors called it irritation from poor materials, but few cared enough to help. Men refused to discuss the subject. Even women spoke of it only in whispers, passing advice that changed little. For those who worked in factories or as servants, the problem was worse. They had no time to rest, no clean water, no privacy. Blood soaked through their clothing as they laboured beside men who pretended not to notice. The heat of the machines and the friction of movement made the smell stronger. Some women stuffed straw or scraps of paper inside their undergarments for extra absorbency. But the material only made things rougher. Their legs chafed, and infections spread easily. Yet they continued to work, because missing a day meant losing wages. The upper class faced the same problem under layers of luxury. Their dresses were made of fine fabrics but were just as impractical. The corsets pressed against their bellies, trapping heat and moisture. Servants were responsible for cleaning the soiled garments, often holding them at arm's length to avoid touching the wet patches. Even perfumed soaps could not remove the smell entirely. The scent of blood lingered beneath the floral oils and powders. It followed women to dinner tables, church pews, and ballrooms. Hygiene during menstruation was nearly impossible. The clothes they used were washed and reused until they disintegrated. Some women boiled them in pots used for cooking, leaving behind a faint iron taste in the air. Others simply buried them in the yard and cut new pieces from old garments. The act of cleaning or disposing of menstrual cloths was done in secret, often late at night. Shame made it dangerous to be discovered, as if natural bleeding proved impurity. At night, the discomfort worsened. The fabric shifted in sleep, and the blood spread across sheets that were never truly clean. They woke to the sticky chill of dried stains. Some tried to hide the evidence by folding their sheets in half before morning. Others scrubbed the fabric with cold water and hung it near the window, hoping the wind would take away the smell. The odour, however, was too strong to vanish completely. It lingered in rooms, blending with the smell of damp clothing and stale air. Women often complained of lower pain, fever, and exhaustion during these days. Many thought it was punishment or weakness rather than a symptom of infection. Their bodies ached, but resting was not allowed. The housework continued, the children still cried, and the meals still needed to be cooked. There was no break for bleeding. The blood simply became another layer of life, another burden to carry without mention. Doctors rarely helped. Some suggested that menstruation was unclean and should be controlled through restraint or prayer. Others blamed women for their own pain. They did not study or treat the infections caused by unhygienic practices. The medical world preferred not to look. The result was countless women left untreated, suffering quietly through fevers, abscesses, and chronic inflammation. The smell was the most difficult part. It was thick, metallic, and impossible to disguise. Perfume only made it worse. The scent clung to clothes, hands, and even hair. When women passed one another in the market, they could recognize the faint iron tang of shared experience. They never spoke of it, but they all knew. The social silence around menstruation made it a secret pain. Women learned to move quietly, to sit carefully, to cross their legs in ways that hid stains. They carried small pieces of fabric in their pockets, ready to press between their legs if they felt a leak. The fear of being seen was stronger than the pain itself. Every month, the same fear returned, and every month, they endured it again. By the end of each cycle, the clothes were stiff, brown, and sour. The next month, they would be used again, and the process would repeat. For many, this routine lasted a lifetime. It shaped their movements, their posture, even their sleep. They lived according to the rhythm of a body that society refused to acknowledge. The women who bled in silence did not know relief. Their blood stained not only their clothing but the air around them. They carried the scent of shame that was never theirs to bear. It is heartbreaking how something so human became something to hide. The stains on their dresses were reminders of everything they were taught to deny. They believed endurance made them respectable, but endurance only deepened their suffering. Each month they began again, caught between modesty and misery. The blood that soaked through their clothes told more truth than they ever could. It spoke of exhaustion, silence, and a kind of strength that left no reward. The next effort to stay clean would not wash away the shame. It would only sink deeper into the skin. Victorian dresses were designed to impress, not to be washed. The fabric was thick, layered, and heavy enough to drag against the ground with every step. Each skirt carried dust, mud, and the remains of everything the wearer had walked through that day. Washing them was nearly impossible. A full dress could weigh more than a child when soaked, and there were no machines or large basins big enough to clean them properly. Women wiped the lower edges with damp cloths, then hung the dresses near windows to dry. The smell of damp fabric filled their rooms, sharp and sour like something half rotten. It is almost absurd how an empire obsessed with propriety allowed its women to live surrounded by filth stitched into their own clothes. The weight of the dress was more than physical. Each layer trapped heat, sweat, and odour close to the body. By the end of the day, the fabric under the arms and around the waist was dark with moisture. When they sat down, the pressure forced the dampness deeper into the seams. The next morning, the fabric had stiffened, carrying a sour musk that blended with the perfume they used to mask it. Washing was considered unnecessary for garments that looked clean on the outside. As long as the dirt was not visible, it was ignored. In winter, washing was unthinkable. The water was freezing, and drying heavy cloth could take days. Women simply brushed off what they could and hoped the cold air would mute the smell. Inside homes, dresses hung from wooden racks like grey ghosts, their hems stiff with mud and wax from the streets. Servants used sponges dipped in soapy water to dab the worst stains, focusing on the lower edges where the grime was thickest. The rest of the fabric remained untouched. If the same habits existed today, it would be like wearing the same coat for months, wiping only the sleeves and calling it clean. The darker fabrics of the era helped hide years of wear. Browns, blacks, and deep greens concealed stains from blood, food, and soot. But up close, the truth was visible. The gaskets where the skirt met the bodice held salt marks from sweat. The inner lining was sticky, stiffened by layers of dried moisture. Even the threads that held the dress together absorbed and kept the smell. A new gown looked elegant for only a few weeks before the build-up began again. The gory mixture of life, menstrual blood, sweat, dust, and sometimes traces of sewage, slowly formed a dark band along the hem. This band told the story of each street walked, each day spent working or visiting. Some women tried to scrub it out with vinegar, but the acid weakened the fabric. Over time, the lower part of the dress frayed and tore, yet it was still worn. To discard a dress for being dirty was wasteful. The garments lasted years, carrying all the layers of their owner's life. Servants were often tasked with maintaining these heavy garments. They lifted the skirts, beat them with sticks, and tried to air them out. The process filled the air with clouds of dust and invisible bacteria. Afterward, their hands were red from scrubbing, and their backs ached from wringing wet cloth that would not dry. For most women, the effort was not worth it. They preferred to keep multiple skirts and rotate them, letting one air out while wearing another equally unclean one. The result was a quiet coexistence with filth. In parlours and carriages, the smell of damp fabric mixed with that of smoke and perfume. The combination became so common that no one noticed it anymore. Men lifted their hats to greet women in gowns that smelled faintly of rot and mildew. Yet the sight of polished shoes and corsets distracted them from the odour. Respectability had more to do with appearances than with hygiene. During social gatherings, the heat of crowded rooms reactivated the smells hidden in the cloth. The sweat trapped from previous days warmed up again, and the fabric released it into the air. Some women carried small bags of herbs or petals in their pockets, pressing them discreetly against their waists to absorb the scent. Others powdered their skirts with starch to give them a cleaner look, but no matter how much perfume or powder they used, the smell lingered, clinging to the folds of the fabric like an old memory that refused to fade. For poorer women, the dresses were even heavier, made from coarse materials that absorbed everything. They owned only 1 or 2 garments for all occasions: work, sleep, and worship. Each day added another layer of dirt. They washed the parts that showed, like sleeves and collars, and left the rest untouched. At night, the dress hung by the door, stiff and cold, still carrying the grime of the day. When worn again in the morning, it softened with body heat, releasing a faint musty scent. Even wealthier households were not free from the same habits. Though they had maids and laundresses, the labour was so demanding that full washing was reserved for emergencies. Water had to be boiled, soap grated by hand, and the heavy skirts dragged through basins large enough to fit livestock. It took several people to wring out the water, and the weight could strain arms and backs. After such effort, many decided it was better to endure the smell than to repeat the process. The build-up beneath the fabric caused irritation and sores. Skin rubbed against stiffened material, leaving marks that never healed properly. Some women developed fungal infections where the moisture collected under the corset. The weight of the skirts also pulled on the hips and back, leaving deep lines on the skin. Yet none of this was considered a problem. The pain and odour were just another part of being feminine. Cleanliness, like comfort, was a privilege. By the end of a season, most dresses were visibly aged, faded at the folds, darker at the hem, and permanently scented with sweat. But they were repaired, patched, and reworked until they fell apart. The dirt became part of their history, pressed into the seams and remembered in the fabric. The women who wore them carried their homes, their streets, and their struggles within the fibres. Each dress was a record of effort disguised as elegance. It is strange to think that the garments seen as symbols of refinement were, in truth, little more than moving containers of decay. Their gowns looked perfect from afar, but up close, they told a different story. The weight of the fabric held more than dirt. It held everything society refused to see. The longer the dresses hung unwashed, the more they became part of the body itself, inseparable from the person who wore them. They continued to wear these gowns with pride, unaware that the next layer of filth they added would soon invite something worse than smell. Shoes in the Victorian era were not made for comfort. They were built to look proper, to keep women's feet small and hidden, as if fragility itself were proof of good character. Most were made of hard leather that did not breathe, bound tightly with laces or buckles. Once worn, the shoes rarely came off. Days passed before a woman could afford to rest long enough to remove them. The skin underneath stayed damp, pressed against the rough lining. When the shoes were finally taken off, the smell was thick and sour, rising like something that had been sealed away for too long. It is hard not to find irony in the fact that what Victorians called refinement began to rot from the toes up. Women's feet were trapped from morning until night. They worked, walked, and stood for hours with no ventilation. combination of sweat, dirt, and leather created the perfect environment for fungus to grow. To make things worse, socks were reused for several days, often without washing. The sweat dried into them, and by the next wear, the fabric softened again with new moisture. The cycle never stopped. The result was skin that cracked, peeled, and emitted a smell so strong it could fill a small room. Removing shoes in public was unthinkable. A woman who did so risked being seen as improper or vulgar. Even inside their homes, some kept them on, afraid of seeming lazy before family or servants. Their feet swelled and turned red, but modesty demanded silence. When the pain became unbearable, they stuffed bits of soft cloth inside to ease the pressure, but that only trapped more moisture. The warmth turned their shoes into small, dark chambers where skin began to decay. The condition was common enough that some doctors wrote about it under vague names like foot rot or ladies' damp infection. Many suffered from it quietly. The skin between their toes turned white and soft, then split open. When they walked, the wounds rubbed against the leather until they bled. But blood and sweat looked the same once absorbed, and no one noticed. If it happened today, it would be like wearing wet sneakers for weeks and pretending the smell meant nothing. For those who worked as servants or labourers, the problem grew worse. Long hours on their feet meant never letting the skin dry. The shoes they owned were old and misshapen, passed down from others. They pinched the toes and rubbed the heels raw. Many wrapped bits of cloth around their feet before slipping them in, hoping to soften the friction. The clothes soon soaked through with sweat and grime. At night, the women loosened the laces but rarely removed the shoes entirely. The cold floors, the fear of vermin, and the lack of privacy kept them trapped inside the same leather shells day and night. The wealthy were not immune either. Their shoes were finer, often imported or custom-made, but they were still tight and sealed. Fashion required a pointed toe and narrow heel, which meant compression of the foot bones. Even gentle walking left blisters. At grand events, women stood for hours, smiling through the pain, their feet swelling inside shoes that smelled faintly of polish and decay. When they returned home, maids helped remove them, peeling off damp stockings that stuck to the skin like another layer of flesh. The air that escaped carried the scent of rot mixed with perfume. The combination of sweat, leather, and heat created something almost chemical. The skin under the nails softened and discoloured, sometimes turning green or black. Nails lifted away, and the flesh underneath festered. The pain was sharp but hidden, locked behind the same silence that kept everything else invisible. Some women sprinkled powder into their shoes, thinking it would keep them dry, but it only formed a paste with the sweat. The smell became thicker, more rancid. When doctors treated infected feet, they often blamed the women for overuse of cosmetics, not realizing the problem came from the shoes themselves. Few treatments worked. Vinegar was sometimes recommended, or strong spirits applied directly to the wounds. These made the pain worse. Women hobbled home from clinics, their bandages soaked through, only to put the same shoes back on. To be barefoot was considered indecent, so they endured. In poor districts, the streets were covered with mud, animal waste, and spilled sewage. Shoes soaked up whatever they stepped on. The leather absorbed the filth, keeping it pressed against the skin. Even after drying, the stench never left. When they walked indoors, it spread through the rooms like an invisible trail. The floors and rugs carried the same smell, and no amount of sweeping could erase it. The odour of feet became part of domestic life, accepted like smoke or dust. By the end of the day, the ache in their feet reached their calves and back. The tight shoes restricted blood flow, leaving their legs heavy and sore. But when they sat down to rest, the relief was mixed with shame. To take off shoes in front of others was improper. Some waited until everyone was asleep, sitting in darkness, to rub their swollen feet in secret. The skin flaked away under their fingers, The damp socks clung to them, leaving marks that looked like bruises. For many, the pain became permanent, the feet hardened, the nails thickened, and walking grew difficult. But even then, no one questioned the habit. Cleanliness was still defined by what could be seen, not what could be smelled. Women continued to polish their shoes and perfume their ankles, hoping it would be enough. The reality remained beneath the surface, hidden like the fungus that refused to die. The odour that clung to their shoes was more than just the scent of sweat. It was a record of long days, of fear, and of rules that cared more about appearance than comfort. It is sad to think that their silence was mistaken for grace. The shoes they never removed became like a second skin, one that trapped every secret of their suffering. And when the leather finally cracked, what came out of it was not only the stench of decay, but the proof of how far they would go to appear pure. The streets of Victorian cities were never clean, and in the summer heat, the smell became unbearable. The air carried a mix of horse waste, rotting food, and unwashed bodies. For women who rarely bathed or changed clothes, their own scent added to it, creating a smell that followed them wherever they went. When they sat in public places, especially near carriage stations or markets, the smell attracted flies. The insects swarmed beneath their skirts, drawn by warmth and the stench trapped in the heavy fabric. It is difficult to imagine how a society so proud of its manners could ignore women being eaten alive by the filth they were forced to live. Newspapers of the time recorded the scenes in shocking detail. Writers described how swarms of flies hovered around the lower parts of women's dresses as they waited for coaches or rested on benches. The insects gathered where the body met the fabric, crawling in and out of folds darkened by sweat and discharge. The women waved their fans and small handkerchiefs to chase them away, pretending it was only the summer air that bothered them. But the truth was visible to anyone who looked long enough. The odour was strong, the flies were many, and shame kept them motionless. Many of the women wore the same undergarments for weeks. The cloth was stiff from old blood, sweat, and waste. The smell was like sour milk left too long in the sun. Insects sensed it instantly. They gathered near the hem of skirts, crawling upward toward the heat. In busy public places, no one dared to mention it. People pretended not to see. Respectability meant silence, even when the air buzzed with flies. At dining areas and inns, the problem grew worse. Women sitting to eat found themselves surrounded by insects drawn to both their plates and their clothes. Some used fans to keep them away, but the movement only stirred the odour trapped under their skirts. Servants brushed flies off tablecloths while pretending not to notice those crawling near their mistresses' laps. The embarrassment was constant but unspoken. It was better to endure quietly than to admit what caused it. If it happened today, it would be like sitting in a cafe while insects circled your body and everyone agreed to pretend nothing was wrong. In warmer months, infestations became common. The heat softened the fabric and intensified the smell of the body beneath. The dampness between layers of clothing created a perfect environment for flies to breed. Some women noticed itching or movement under their garments, but assumed it was only irritation from sweat. By the time they discovered the truth, eggs had already been laid in the lining of their underwear. The larvae hatched quickly in the warmth, feeding on sweat and fabric fibres. For many, the realization came only when they removed their clothing days later and saw small wriggling shapes near the seams. The shame of such a discovery was unbearable. Women could not tell anyone, not even doctors. To admit it would be to confess uncleanliness. Instead, they tried to wash the garments with vinegar or perfume them heavily. Some even burned their underclothes to destroy the evidence. The stench of scorched fabric and decay filled narrow alleys behind tenement houses, yet no one asked questions. The silence of modesty was stronger than the desire for help. Flies thrived in cities where waste was everywhere. Open drains ran beside houses, and garbage piled up in alleys. The insects moved easily between filth and flesh, carrying disease. They landed on food in markets, on wounds in hospitals, and on the bodies of women sitting too long in the sun. Doctors began to notice cases of skin infections caused by fly larvae, but few connected them to hygiene. They called it summer rash or heat boils, giving the suffering a polite name that hid its real cause. The upper classes were not exempt. Their layers of silk and linen trapped moisture just as effectively as coarse wool. In carriages lined with velvet, the air was thick and unmoving. The warmth from their bodies made perfect breeding grounds for flies hidden in the folds of their gowns. When they stepped out in public, the insects came with them. At afternoon teas or outdoor concerts, some women used lace parasols not for shade but to discreetly wave away the buzzing around their skirts. Still, the flies always returned. For poorer women, the problem was constant and far worse. In crowded tenements with no sewage or clean water, the air swarmed with flies day and night. They laid eggs on laundry hanging to dry, on blankets, even on the bodies of sleeping children. Women woke to find insects crawling across their skin. Their dresses, rarely washed and always damp, became magnets for everything alive in the filth around them. Each step through the street stirred up clouds of insects that followed them home. The infestation was more than just discomfort. Some women developed open sores where flies had laid eggs near the skin. These wounds grew quickly infected. Without medical care, the tissue decayed. The smell became unbearable, attracting even more insects. It was a cycle of rot that no one wanted to acknowledge. Men blamed women for their own decay, accusing them of laziness or impurity. No one saw that their poverty and modesty had left them no escape. At night, the buzzing did not stop. Flies crept through windows, drawn to the same smell that lingered under layers of clothing. The air vibrated with the sound of their wings. Women lay awake, swatting blindly, too tired to move. Some slept sitting up, afraid of what might crawl over them if they lay still. The fatigue etched itself into their faces, yet the next morning they dressed again, stepped into the same streets, and lived the same routine. The sight of flies clinging to the hems of dresses became so common that no one remarked on it. It was simply part of city life. The smell, the buzzing, the slow decay of the flesh beneath all faded into the background of normal existence. The women carried on, pretending not to notice the creatures drawn to them. Their silence was heavier than the air around them. It is unbearable to imagine how something as small as a fly could reveal the truth about how deeply the body had been neglected. The buzzing of those flies became the sound of the streets themselves, a reminder that beneath the perfume and civility, the empire was rotting in plain sight. The layers of clothing Victorian women wore were not meant for comfort. Beneath their outer gowns were petticoats, corsets, chemises, and drawers, each trapping a little more heat with every layer. In the summer, the air between these fabrics turned damp and suffocating. Sweat gathered under the corset and between the thighs, soaking into the linen until it clung like a second skin. The fabric rubbed constantly against the flesh, leaving the skin red and raw. It is unsettling to realize that what was called modesty back then was often just another word for slow suffocation. The undergarments were rarely washed. The women wore them for days, sometimes weeks, until the smell became too strong to ignore. The sweat mixed with dust, body oils, and flakes of dead skin, creating a sticky layer that glued fabric to the body. When the clothes were finally removed, the air beneath them was thick, humid, and sour. The folds of the stomach and thighs were covered in rashes. Some areas cracked open, leaking clear fluid that stained the cloth. Yet even then, washing was avoided because water was considered dangerous to women's health. In crowded rooms or on long carriage rides, the trapped heat made the smell worse. It was strongest around the lower belly and between the legs, a sour scent of sweat and decay. Servants noticed it most when helping their mistresses dress or undress. They moved quickly, pretending not to breathe. The odour was strongest when corsets were unfastened and the body underneath was suddenly released. Some servants described it as the smell of a room that had never been opened. The constant moisture softened the skin until it broke down. The area beneath the stomach, where fabric pressed tightly, stayed warm and wet all day. Fungal infections spread easily. The skin turned red and patchy, sometimes covered in white flakes. Between the thighs, the friction caused sores that burned with every step. Still, women endured it quietly, thinking the pain was just part of being female. If we compared it to today, it would be like wearing wet jeans for weeks and calling it elegance. Many women applied powders to absorb the sweat, but the powders only mixed with moisture to form a paste that darkened the fabric. Others used small cloth pads between the skin and clothing, but these quickly soaked through. The more they tried to cover the problem, the worse it became. Some even used alcohol or vinegar to wipe the skin, believing it would cleanse the area. Instead, it stung and deepened the cracks. The corset made everything worse. It pressed down on the stomach, forcing sweat into the folds of skin. It restricted air circulation and left no space for the body to cool. Women fainted often, but fainting was seen as a delicate trait, not a warning sign. Beneath the layers of lace and ribbon, their bodies were suffocating in their own heat. The smell was strongest by night, when the clothes were finally loosened. The air release carried the scent of sweat trapped for days, heavy and sour enough to fill the room. The poorer women suffered the most. They had fewer clothes, but they wore them harder. Labour made them sweat constantly, and the same undergarments had to last through work and sleep. Without clean water or soap, they could not wash properly. The heat of their small rooms and the friction of long days made the skin between their thighs rough and discoloured. Infections spread quietly. They itched, scratched, and bled, but said nothing. Shame was stronger than pain. Among the upper classes, the same problem was hidden behind perfume. Women sprinkled scented powders between their thighs and under their corsets before attending social events. For a few hours, the fragrance masked the truth. But as the evening wore on and the room filled with body heat, the smell returned, stronger and sharper. The combination of sweat, perfume, and powder formed a scent that clung to fabrics for days. No one spoke of it, though everyone noticed. Doctors occasionally treated women for female irritation. They blamed poor posture, nerves, or even sin, rather than the obvious cause. No one thought that the clothing itself might be responsible. Advice columns in women's magazines recommended light airing of undergarments, but avoided any mention of washing the body. Cleanliness was a luxury, and comfort was seen as vanity. By the end of a long day, the moisture beneath the layers turned cold. The fabric stuck to the skin like glue. When peeled away, it left the surface tender and glistening. Some women applied talc or camphor to ease the soreness, only to worsen the irritation. The cycle never ended. The body became a place of quiet torment, dressed up in lace and called grace. In households where women had servants, the smell of sweat-laden clothes lingered in the laundry rooms. Servants washed what they could, but the water grew grey and foul within minutes. The fabric never felt truly clean. When dried, it carried a faint sourness that returned as soon as the body warmed it again. Clean clothes were only clean until worn. The constant contact of damp fabric reshaped the body over time. Skin under the corset thickened, darkened, and lost sensitivity. The thighs rubbed together so often that the skin between them hardened like leather. Some women could no longer feel the difference between pain and normalcy. They lived in a constant state of irritation, their bodies protesting against their clothes. It is strange to think how society prized these women for their composure while their bodies were rotting quietly beneath their garments. The more they covered themselves, the more the smell betrayed what they tried to hide. They continued to layer fabric over sweat, pretending it was refinement. Beneath the folds of their dresses, the air stayed heavy and unclean, and when they finally undressed at night, what emerged was not relief, but the realization that even their own skin no longer felt like their own. In many Victorian homes, there was always one thing in abundance, Ash, It came from every fireplace, every stove, every candle that burned too long. For women who had no soap or water to spare, it became their tool for cleanliness. They wrapped the fine grey powder in small cloths and rubbed it against their skin, pressing it into the armpits, between the thighs, and along the spine. The ash was meant to absorb sweat and odour, and for a short moment it seemed to work. The skin felt dry, the smell seemed hidden, and the black dust left a strange sense of relief. It is darkly amusing that they mistook the colour of soot for the colour of purity. Over time, the ash mixed with the body's own moisture. Sweat turned it into a gritty paste that clung to the skin like a second layer. When the mixture dried, it left dark patches that flaked and cracked. The more they rubbed, the thicker the crust became. Each new application pressed the old one deeper into the pores. Women began to believe that the blacker their skin became, the cleaner they must be, the soot in their minds sealed the dirt inside rather than removed it. The smell changed, too. Instead of sweat, the air around them carried the scent of burnt wood and old smoke. It was heavy and dry, like the inside of a cold chimney. The ash dulled the natural odour of the body but replaced it with one that clung to everything: their clothes, their hair, even their bed sheets. Servants who helped them dress complained quietly of the residue, but saying anything risked offence, so they dusted off what they could and pretended it was normal. The poor relied on ash because it was free. Every home had a pile of it by the hearth. After cooking or heating, they swept it into small buckets, saving it for washing. A handful of ash and a few drops of water made a paste strong enough to scour pans, floors, and now skin. The roughness of the mixture scraped away the top layer of dirt and dead cells, but it also tore tiny cuts into the flesh. The pain that followed was ignored. Women thought the burning meant it was working. If it were done today, it would be like cleaning your skin with sandpaper and calling it exfoliation. Among the upper classes, ash baths were given a more elegant disguise. Mixed with perfume or rose oil, the powder was placed in small linen bags and sold as natural purifiers. Women dabbed them along their necks and arms before bed, believing the scent would ward off odour through the night. In the morning, the residue stained their collars grey. Over time, the fine particles worked into the fabric, giving it a dull, smoky sheen. Even expensive lace could not hide the mark of ash once it settled. The repeated use caused serious irritation. The skin grew rough, the pores clogged, and infections followed. The darkened areas under the arms and between the legs became sore and inflamed. Some women developed abscesses that burst and left scars, but the practice continued. The visible black dust was proof of effort, and effort was mistaken for cleanliness. When others saw the ash stains on a woman's neck or under her sleeve, they thought of diligence, not decay. Inside homes, the smell of ash was everywhere. It rose from the hearth, from the laundry, from the people themselves. The fine dust floated in the air, settling on food and furniture. Children played beside piles of it, unaware that their mothers used the same powder on their skin. When guests visited, the faint scent of smoke clung to every handshake, every hug. No one questioned it. It was the smell of daily life. In summer, the problem worsened. Heat mixed with sweat turned the ash into a sticky coating. It itched constantly. Women scratched until their skin bled, then rubbed more ash over the wounds to stop the bleeding. The grey powder caked over the blood, forming small black scabs. From a distance, it looked like dirt, but to them, it was a sign of being kept. They thought of it as proof that they had tended to their bodies, even when their bodies were begging to breathe. Doctors occasionally wrote about the ash habit in journals, noting the strange grey patches on women's backs and thighs. Some believed it came from poor laundry, others thought it was a skin disease. None understood how deliberate it was. When asked, women defended the practice proudly, saying the ash kept them clean when water could not. To them, the idea of washing with soap was foreign, even dangerous. The ash was safe, familiar, and part of womanhood. The poor used it even more heavily during their menstrual cycles. They pressed ashes against their thighs and under their skirts to cover odour and absorb moisture. The combination of blood and soot hardened into a dark crust that clung for days. When removed, it took bits of skin with it. The pain that followed was unbearable, yet no one stopped. They believed the discomfort was a sign that it had worked. The fireplaces that warmed their homes also became their sources of hygiene. Every spark that burned another piece of wood created more of the powder they needed. The cycle never ended. They burned to live, then used the remains to clean what the burning had soiled. The very thing that blackened their walls and lungs now blackened their skin in the name of purity. The bodies of these women grew tougher, their skin thicker, their pores darker. The black dust filled every crease and fold until it became impossible to tell where ash ended and skin began. When they slept, it rubbed off on their sheets, forming faint outlines of their bodies. Even in death, when the skin dried, the traces of soot remained, proof that cleanliness had cost them their flesh. It is haunting to think that the same ash that built warmth and comfort also marked the bodies of those who had nowhere else to turn. They scrubbed until the skin was grey, believing each stroke made them purer. Yet the more they cleaned, the dirtier they became. The illusion of purity left its mark on every inch of them, and when they reached for another handful of ash, they could not tell that the filth they feared was already part of their skin. Hair washing, in the Victorian age, was not an act of care but an act of fear. Women avoided it for entire seasons, believing that cold water could disturb the mind and that wet hair might cause hysteria or even madness. The idea was simple, but cruel purity was not about being clean. It was about restraint. So they restrained themselves from touching their own scalps. As weeks turned into months, oil and soot gathered layer by layer until the hair became stiff and sticky, more like cloth than strands. The odour was sour and smoky, clinging to every movement like a shadow that refused to leave. They tied their hair tightly to hide the filth, wrapping it with ribbons and silk scarves that soon absorbed the same smell. Beneath the coverings, lice made their home. The insects thrived in the warmth, their eggs gluing themselves to the roots. When the women scratched, they disturbed a small world of dust, skin, and movement. Fingertips came away black with grease and dried pus. It is astonishing how something so small as fear of water could create a generation terrified of their own reflection. Some tried to brush their hair clean, dragging the comb through resistance that snapped strands apart. The brush collected lumps of dirt and oil, which hardened overnight like wax. Water was not the only thing they avoided. Even steam was thought to be dangerous for the head. Bathing rooms were cold, and fireplaces did little to warm the air. Washing hair meant hours of discomfort, dripping water across stone floors, and risking chills that society said could end a woman's sanity. So they preferred perfume, powders, and the illusion of freshness. The scalp, trapped under layers of scent, became a breeding ground of infection. Small red patches appeared, then scabs, and eventually sores that crusted and bled under the weight of unwashed hair. Still, they endured it quietly, convinced that pain was safer than madness. The rich suffered no less than the poor. In grand houses, scented oils replaced soap, and combs made of bone glided through thick filth with practised grace. Servants helped their mistresses cleanse by rubbing powder into the roots, though the only thing truly removed was dignity. If the same logic were applied today, people would call it self-care to let their hair rot in silence. The oils trapped more dust, the powders hardened into a paste, and the scalp beneath suffocated. When the time came to finally wash, some women found their hair breaking off in clumps, yet they would rather lose it than be accused of moral weakness. Doctors reinforced these fears, insisting that too much washing weakened the nervous system. They recommended combing and restraint as signs of modesty. Newspapers praised women who preserved their natural oils, as if dirt itself were a virtue. The result was a quiet epidemic of infections no one dared to name. The smell lingered in every home, seeping into pillows and curtains. Men joked that women carried winter musk, but the humour only disguised their discomfort. Beneath the laughter was the truth everyone ignored, the stench of rot mistaken for refinement. In the evenings, when they loosened their hair, strands clung together in thick ropes. Flecks of dandruff fell like ash. The scalp stung from scratching, and the relief never lasted long. When they looked in mirrors, their hair seemed dull and lifeless, but the alternative, washing, was too frightening to consider. They powdered, tied, and perfumed until even they could not tell where the smell began or ended. In that mixture of candle wax, sweat, and rotting skin, the illusion of beauty decayed silently. I can't help but feel that what they feared most, losing control, had already happened the moment they stopped caring for themselves. The refusal to wash was not vanity, but surrender, a quiet acceptance that pain was easier than change. Hair, once a symbol of femininity, became a burden carried through every season, heavy with the proof of superstition. The scalp, hidden beneath the veil of false modesty, told a story no one wanted to hear. It was the smell of fear, the texture of ignorance, and the touch of decay. The women of that time believed that stillness kept them safe, but their silence bred sickness. They carried it on their heads like a crown no one envied, a weight that grew heavier with every passing winter. The hair they feared to wash became both a shield and a curse. Beneath its weight, the scalp suffered in silence, feeding the insects and infections that no one dared to name. What they thought kept them pure only proved how easily fear could disguise itself as virtue. The smell of a Victorian woman was something that could enter a room before she did. It was not the gentle scent of perfume or flowers, but a thick, sour odour that clung to air and fabric alike. Newspapers of the time wrote that one could sit several steps away and still sense it, the way smoke seeps through a house long after the fire has gone out. It was a smell that marked class, routine, and neglect all at once. Some said it came from the layers of unwashed fabric. Others whispered it was the scent of sickness itself, whatever its cause. It became a presence that followed women everywhere, an invisible proof of their suffering. The odour began at the skin. Months without proper washing allowed sweat to ferment beneath corsets and petticoats. The mixture of wool, silk, and cotton created a greenhouse effect where bacteria grew quietly. Every movement released a faint wave of decay. Women tried to disguise it with scented oils, rose powder, or lavender sachets hidden in their clothes. These sweet notes did not erase the stench, only transformed it into something stranger. It was as if rot had learned to wear perfume. The result was so strong that some men described feeling dizzy after prolonged proximity, though politeness kept them silent. In crowded carriages, the air grew unbearable. A single journey through London could leave the seats coated with a mixture of coal dust and human sweat. Passengers opened windows even in the freezing cold, choosing the bite of winter air over the heaviness that hung inside. Doctors began to comment in journals about the peculiar feminine odour of the time, though they used vague, polite language. To describe it too clearly would have been improper, yet the truth was plain enough for anyone with a nose. It was the smell of closed rooms, tight clothing, and fear of water. For the poor, who worked in factories or kitchens, the odour became part of survival. Their clothes absorbed smoke, grease, and soot, until no amount of scrubbing could change their colour. Sweat dried into the fabric, forming stiff layers that cracked at the seams. Even after removing their dresses, the smell stayed on the skin like a mark of labour. In small rooms shared by several people, the combined air was heavy and sharp. Children grew up knowing the smell of their mothers before the sound of their voices. It was not shameful to them, only normal. The wealthy fared no better. only differently. Their perfumes were imported, their powders expensive, their clothes stitched from fine material that trapped heat more efficiently. Instead of cleaning, they covered. The sweet scent of violets or musk drifted over decay, creating a confusing mixture that seemed almost alive. When they attended parties, the room filled with layers of odor flowers, sweat, smoke, and candle wax melting together into something human yet unbearable. Servants cleaning after the events often wrote about the stale air that lingered for hours, as if the walls themselves had inhaled it. Even writers noticed. Poets spoke of the fragrance of mortality, a phrase meant to be delicate but rooted in truth. Painters avoided capturing the reality of those gatherings, preferring to imagine freshness on the canvas. Reality smelled nothing like that. If it happened today, it would be like people spraying deodorant over mold and calling it hygiene. The stench of repression was everywhere. The tighter the corset, the less air reached the skin, and the more the body fermented under its own restraint. In homes, ventilation was almost non-existent. Windows were kept shut to block cold air or the gaze of strangers. Fires burned constantly, filling the rooms with smoke that clung to hair and fabric. Curtains, carpets, and bedding absorbed everything, holding on to the essence of daily life. Even after washing the hands or face, the smell returned as soon as the clothes were put back on. Guests visiting would notice but remain silent, their politeness stronger than their discomfort. Those who lived in it could no longer tell the difference between clean and foul. Doctors called it natural feminine odour, believing it was part of biology rather than poor hygiene. Few dared to suggest bathing more frequently, fearing moral backlash. The Victorian obsession with modesty had turned smell into destiny. Women's bodies were treated as things to conceal, not to care for. Each layer of fabric became another barrier between them and the truth. By the time the smell reached others, it was already too late to fix. Infection, sweat, and decay had merged into one continuous presence that perfume could only confuse, never erase. Inside the home, the smell clung to every surface. Wooden furniture absorbed it, especially near fireplaces, where heat made everything expand and release the trapped odour. Bedsheets turned sour from sweat that never fully dried. Even lace gloves carried the faint trace of decay, warmed by skin and time. Servants complained of headaches after dressing their mistresses, and some fainted in the closed dressing rooms. Yet the ritual continued daily, each step another layer of denial painted with powder and oil. Outdoors, things were no better. The city itself was an extension of the human smell. Sewers overflowed, horses filled the streets with waste, and the fog mixed everything together. Against this background, personal stench blended easily. Still, those closest to women noticed it most. Husbands wrote in private letters about their wives' persistent odour, describing it with reluctant affection, as if loving someone meant accepting their decay. It was the perfume of repression and rot, carried in silence because no one dared to break the illusion. I cannot help but think that they lived inside their own perfume of denial, convinced that to stink was to be proper. The body was not an instrument of care but a symbol of endurance. To endure filth without complaint was considered a virtue. The air around them grew thick with the evidence of that belief. No matter how much powder they wore or how wide the skirt spread, the smell betrayed them. It was the scent of fear turned solid, lingering like a ghost in every parlour and carriage. When night came, the odour did not rest. It thickened in bedrooms where windows stayed shut and fires smouldered low. Pillows absorbed it, blankets carried it, and in the morning, the air was stale before the first light appeared. It was more than just a smell now. It was a condition of existence. The house, the body, and the century itself seemed soaked in it. The smell followed women like a shadow, silent but impossible to ignore. It reminded everyone that purity built on ignorance always rots from within. It was not the perfume of life, but of something half alive, suspended between decay and pride. The stench that once announced their presence became a part of who they were. It filled the rooms, the fabrics, and even the air they called home. What caused it would soon be treated as a symbol of refinement rather than the warning it truly was. The corset was more than a garment. It was a cage disguised as beauty. Victorian women wore it from morning until night, sometimes even as they slept. It hugged their ribs so tightly that breathing itself became a discipline. The fabric absorbed every trace of sweat and oil, pressed deep into the folds of skin. The mix of silk, cotton, and whalebone turned the corset into something alive, something that remembered every heartbeat and every drop of moisture. Over time, the material stiffened, hardened by layers of grime until it resembled bark more than cloth. Removing it was not a relief, but an ordeal. When the corset finally came off, the skin beneath told a story of quiet suffering. Red lines carved across the ribs, damp and sore. Beneath the breasts, where air never reached, the skin peeled and glistened. The smell was unmistakable, a sharp, sour scent that came from trapped sweat and dying cells. Women called it the cost of grace. It is disturbing to think that beauty, for them, required rotting slowly beneath lace. They powdered the skin, hoping to ease the sting, but the powder only mixed with the dampness, turning into a paste that burned even more. Each morning, they returned to the same ritual, tightening the same strings, pressing filth deeper into flesh. For the rich, corsets were symbols of discipline. To loosen them was considered lazy, even sinful. Servants laced their mistresses until the breath caught in their throats, then tied the final knot with quiet precision. In homes where the air was heavy with smoke, the corset trapped not only the body but the very stench of the house. The warmth of human skin blended with the odour of burning candles and coal, forming a scent that never truly left the fabric. Even when hung to dry, the corset exhaled that smell, as though the body inside it still lingered. The poor suffered in silence, their corsets made of a rougher material that chafed and scratched. They could not afford replacements, so one corset served for years, worn until the stitching failed. They repaired it with thread, patching over stains that never came out. Washing was nearly impossible. Water loosened the boning and warped the shape, and no one could spare the time to dry it in winter. Instead, they aired it near the fire, letting the heat bake the residue into permanence. The next morning the corset was stiff, warm, and faintly sour. Still, they wrapped themselves in it, because a woman without a corset was considered half-dressed, half-respectable, half-human. Doctors saw the consequences but rarely spoke about them. Infections beneath the chest, fungal growth along the ribs, and sores that refused to heal were common. They called it skin fatigue or female irritation, never daring to connect it to the corset. To suggest that fashion itself made women sick would have been scandalous. So the silence continued, one patient at a time, until sickness became another form of modesty. If people today wore something so tight and filthy for months, it would be called self-torture, not elegance. Yet the women of that age accepted it as proof of character, believing endurance made them noble. Some corsets were passed down from mother to daughter. The fabric softened with age but carried the smell of generations. Opening a family chest was like opening history itself, powder, sweat, and dust rising together in one familiar cloud. No one thought to clean them. Instead, they were polished, mended, and cherished, their filth treated as sentimental rather than shameful. A daughter wearing her mother's corset believed she was inheriting strength. What she truly inherited was decay pressed deep into fabric, invisible but enduring. At night, women loosened the strings but rarely removed the corset completely. Without its pressure, the body felt strange, unstable. The ribs ached, The lungs struggled to expand, and the flesh beneath the stays throbbed with blood returning too quickly. Some described the feeling as a burning in the heart. They covered the area with scarves or soft cloth, pretending it was just the chill of winter. In truth, it was an infection. The skin was raw and alive, trying to heal while still suffocating under the next day's laces. The smell became a kind of signature. Husbands knew it, children knew it, and servants learned to tolerate it. It was the scent of sweat, soap that never reached the skin, and the faint metallic tang of decay. Corsets stored it perfectly, holding every note until the heat released it again. In summer, the odour grew unbearable. Flies followed women in gardens, and faint stains appeared through the layers of their dresses. Still, the corset remained, for to remove it would mean admitting that the system itself was rotten. The pressure of the stays reshaped the body. Over the years, the ribs curved inward, the stomach collapsed, and the spine stiffened unnaturally. Breathing became shallow, digestion slowed, and the skin beneath lost its colour. The corset created the illusion of perfection while destroying everything underneath. Yet women praised one another for their discipline, for the smoothness of their waist, for their ability to endure without complaint. Each compliment was a small reward for the pain they never voiced. I think the saddest part is how suffering was mistaken for elegance, as if pain could be a form of grace. Beneath the corset, life itself slowed. The pulse weakened, the breath shortened, and the body forgot what freedom felt like. The corset was not just an object of fashion, but a tool of control, one that made women complicit in their own discomfort. They carried their prison proudly, unaware that it had already begun to consume them. In quiet bedrooms, the removal of the corset was both a relief and a revelation. The skin beneath steamed faintly in the cold air, damp with the residue of the day. The odour rose like truth, undeniable and raw. Some wept without knowing why, their bodies trembling from the sudden space inside their chests. The fabric hung limply over the chair, still warm, still breathing in its own way. In the faint candlelight, the corset seemed to watch, as if waiting to return to its place by morning. They lived within that cycle, binding and unbinding, suffering and pretending, until pain became indistinguishable from normality. The corset, unwashed and unyielding, was both armour and curse. It trapped their bodies and silenced their complaints. It shaped not only their waists but their lives, pressing the breath out of every moment they lived. The scent of leather, sweat, and human endurance filled the air of every room where a woman dressed. It was the perfume of the age, strong enough to linger long after she left. And in that lingering scent, one could sense not beauty or power, but exhaustion. It was the smell of bodies that forgot what comfort felt like, and of women taught to endure rather than to exist. The corset's grip was more than physical. It held the spirit itself in its ties. As long as women wore it, they carried a quiet reminder that their worth was measured by how much pain they could bear without protest. The pressure of beauty had never smelled so human. It lingered in fabrics, in air, and in memory. It was the scent of endurance mistaken for pride, and the echo of bones reshaped in silence. The corset, once the symbol of grace, became the proof of how far they were willing to go for acceptance. And what began as a mark of elegance would soon reveal something far more disturbing hiding beneath the seams. There were parts of the Victorian body that no one spoke of, not out of shame alone, but because they were forgotten. The navel and the space beneath the breasts were among those quiet corners of neglect. They were never washed, never aired, never seen. Hidden beneath the corset and layers of petticoats, they existed in a kind of darkness that the century itself refused to illuminate. Women scrubbed their faces and powdered their necks, but their middles remained untouched, sealed away from soap and air for weeks, sometimes months. In that warm, enclosed silence, sweat gathered and turned to a thin film of grime that hardened like wax. the body decayed quietly in the name of modesty. When a woman dressed each morning, she fastened her corset until the flesh beneath her ribs folded and pressed together. The skin under her breasts became damp and sticky, collecting the heat of her breath and the closeness of the fabric. The mixture of sweat, powder, and perfume created a paste that dried white and flaky by nightfall. The same thing happened at her navel, a small hollow that trapped lint, moisture, and dead skin. Days passed, then weeks, and the residue grew thicker. The smell was faint at first, sour like milk left out too long, but it deepened with every sunrise. It is unsettling how easily neglect can masquerade as decency when the world demands silence instead of care. Servants sometimes saw the results when dressing their mistresses: a rash spreading under the bust, a scab forming where fabric rubbed too long, or a faint odour that no perfume could cover. But speaking of it was dangerous. A lady's body was sacred, and to mention its decay was a kind of insult. So they worked in silence, tightening laces over sores, pretending not to notice the red patches that stained the linen. The pain was constant, a burning discomfort hidden under lace and steel. By evening, when the corset was loosened, the air against the skin stung like punishment. For poorer women, the situation was worse. They worked in kitchens or factories where heat made them sweat endlessly. The fabric rubbed raw against their skin, yet washing remained a rare luxury. They lacked the privacy and the warm water needed for proper cleaning. Even if they wanted to, few could risk catching a cold in the damp air of winter, so they endured, wiping what they could with a cloth, leaving the rest to dry naturally. The result was a layer of hardened salt and grime beneath the clothing, an invisible armour of exhaustion. It was said that the poorest women smelled of bread and mould, the scent of yeast mixed with sweat. The wealthier ones hid the same condition behind fragrance and decorum. They dusted their bodies with fine powders and wore perfume sachets in their corsets. These sweet covers only worsened the problem, trapping heat and moisture even more efficiently. Beneath the surface, the skin festered. Infections began as small irritations and turned into fungal blooms, especially around the navel. Some women developed ulcers that oozed faintly, staining the inside of their dresses. Physicians wrote in careful language about dermal distress and feminine eruptions, never admitting the cause was simple neglect. If someone lived like that today, people would call it an illness of the body and the mind. But back then, it was simply called good manners. Letters and diaries rarely mention such discomfort, but fragments remain. One woman wrote of a persistent burning beneath my bosom that worsened with every summer. Another noted a spot near the stomach that refuses to heal. They did not know that what grew there was a fungus feeding on warmth and darkness. They thought it was their fault, a sign of weakness, a punishment for vanity. Even nurses avoided those areas when tending to women in hospitals. Modesty mattered more than comfort. Cleaning the navel or the folds beneath the breasts was considered improper, even when infection spread. In bedrooms where the air never moved, the odour lingered quietly. It mixed with candle smoke, damp linen, and perfume, forming a sweetness that turned sour. Husbands pretended not to notice. They blamed the smell on the coal fires or the must of winter clothes. Yet when they undressed their wives, the truth rose unmistakably from the skin. It was the scent of the human body confined too tightly and washed too little. The same scent that filled laundry rooms, lingering in corsets and undergarments, hung too close to the hearth. It was the hidden perfume of a world afraid of its own flesh. The rashes became part of life. Women learned to apply cloth soaked in vinegar or to dust the sores with starch. These remedies soothed the burning but never cured it. The cause was always the same, the refusal to touch what was considered private. The skin continued to break, the wounds deepened, and the body bore it silently. When infection spread, doctors prescribed rest or tonics, never water. They saw illness in everything but filth, even as the skin turned raw and the navel darkened with crusted residue. Cleanliness was never discussed. The sickness was hidden behind curtains and corsets, left to heal or rot on its own. I find it tragic that something as gentle as washing could once be seen as dangerous. While slow decay was accepted as the price of dignity, the women who lived through that time believed restraint was virtue, and restraint meant never reaching too far, never touching too deep. The places they avoided became symbols of their obedience. Beneath their gowns, the body suffered in silence, shaped by rules written by people who never had to bear them. At night, when the rooms grew cold and still, the pain pulsed softly under the skin. Some women pressed their hands to their ribs, feeling the heat trapped there, the sting that refused to fade. They told themselves it was fatigue or the weight of the day, never infection. The smell was faint but constant, drifting up each time they moved beneath the covers. It filled the bed, the pillow, the fabric itself. In the morning, they rose and dressed again, repeating the same mistake, continuing the same silence. The body adapted, as it always does. The skin hardened, the rashes dulled, and the discomfort became familiar. That familiarity was the cruelest part of all. They no longer felt what they were losing. Comfort became a memory, replaced by endurance. The women who carried that burden did not complain, for complaint required acknowledging the thing they were taught to ignore. By the end of the century, doctors began to notice patterns, women dying of infections that began on the skin. But no one spoke of where those infections started. It was easier to blame the climate, or faintness, or fragile constitution. To name the truth would have meant admitting that the foundation of decency was built on dirt. In the forgotten spaces beneath corsets and along the hollow of the navel, the human body decayed quietly. There were no screams, no outcry, only the faint smell of sweat turned sour, the colour of infection spreading like a shadow. It was the proof that even in an age obsessed with purity, neglect could rot the soul as easily as the flesh. They lived inside their own silence, and their bodies bore the cost of it. The stains, the sores, the smell. They were all whispers of what happened when modesty turned into fear. The forgotten skin beneath the corset and the navel carried more truth than the polished faces above it. And from those hidden wounds, something far more insidious was beginning to spread through the bodies of Victorian women, unseen but already unstoppable. Victorian women carried handkerchiefs everywhere, but not as delicate accessories as paintings would have us believe. These small squares of fabric were their only means of dealing with sweat in a world where washing was avoided and modesty was everything. They were used not for wiping the face in public, but for pressing against the body in secret. A lady sitting in a carriage would discreetly slide the cloth under her arm or along her neck, dabbing the moisture that gathered beneath layers of corsets and lace. The cloth absorbed everything, the sourness of sweat and the faint residue of perfume, until it became a quiet witness to the daily decay hidden beneath elegance. When the task was done, the handkerchief was never washed. Washing meant admitting that something was unclean. Instead, it was folded neatly and tucked into the pocket of a dress or the lining of a skirt. There, in the darkness and warmth, it began to change. Moisture turned to dampness, dampness to mould, and the mould to a sour, leathery smell. After a few days, the fabric stiffened. The next time the woman reached for it, the cloth felt heavier, as if it carried the weight of the air she had tried to purify. It is unsettling how something meant for cleanliness became another layer of contamination. Some women kept several handkerchiefs, one for the face, another for the body, yet none were washed regularly. In upper-class homes, servants were responsible for laundry, but they were instructed to touch only outer garments. Anything that came into contact with the body was considered too private. Servants learned to look away when their mistress discreetly placed a damp cloth into her pocket, pretending not to notice the smell that followed. In poor households, the same piece of cloth might be used for days until it was too stiff to fold. By then, it carried a scent that could only be described as human fatigue. The mixture of sweat and starch created something unique. When warmed by the body's heat, the fabric released a faint odour, both sour and sweet, that clung to the person like an invisible halo. In crowded rooms, it mingled with perfume and candle smoke, creating an atmosphere that felt dense and alive. The handkerchief, though small, played its part in this strange ecosystem of smell. It was a symbol of modest control, proof that a woman could manage her body without ever washing it. The illusion of cleanliness replaced the act itself. For those who worked long hours or travelled through London's polluted streets, the handkerchief became indispensable. It absorbed not only sweat but soot from chimneys, dust from the road, and the faint oil that rose from the skin. After a day's work, the cloth was nearly black. Yet women continued to use it, believing that the gesture itself was enough to keep them respectable. A quick press to the neck, a gentle pat on the chest, and the world would assume they were fresh. The truth hid quietly in their pockets, rotting one day at a time. In winter, when the air was cold and rooms were sealed shut, the smell grew stronger. The clothes, warmed by the body, became breeding grounds for bacteria, though no one knew that word then. Some women sprinkled rosewater or camphor onto them to mask the odour, creating a mix of sweetness and decay. When they pressed the cloth against their skin again, the sting of alcohol met the burn of salt, and the result was pain disguised as elegance. They smiled through it, believing that endurance made them refined. The wealthy had embroidered handkerchiefs made of silk or lace. These fine fabrics absorbed less but trapped more scent. The lace edges, often stained with powder or rouge, turned yellow with time. A whiff of one of these handkerchiefs could reveal the secret of its owner's hygiene, though no one dared to speak of it aloud. Servants knew to handle them carefully, folding them as if they were sacred objects. Even when the smell clung to their fingers afterward, the cloth became a metaphor for the entire society, beautiful to the eye and rotting beneath the surface. If such habits existed today, people would call them unhygienic, yet in the Victorian mind, they were marks of grace. In the homes of the poor, the story was simpler and sadder. A woman might use the same rag for wiping sweat, cleaning a child's face, and dusting a table. She carried it everywhere, tucked into her apron, wet and sour from constant use. Each time she reached for it, the smell rose again, a sharp reminder of life's closeness to decay. There was no perfume to hide it, no illusion to soften it. Her handkerchief was not a symbol of refinement, but of survival. Still, she folded it carefully at the end of the day, just like her richer counterparts, believing that small gestures held dignity. The accumulation of these tiny acts created an entire culture of quiet filth. Women exchanged tips on how to refresh a handkerchief without washing it, like hanging it near an open window or rubbing it with lavender oil. These methods did little more than shift the smell from sour to sickly sweet. Over time, the scent became part of the environment. Guests entering a drawing room could sense it in the air, faint but persistent, the ghost of 1,000 handkerchiefs hidden in pockets and drawers. Some doctors noted the odour in their patients, but avoided mentioning it. To comment on such matters was improper. Instead, they recommended powders or tonics to soothe the system. A few even praised the restraint of women who managed their bodies with discretion. The handkerchief became an emblem of that discretion, a quiet substitute for water and soap. The irony was that this small act of concealment often caused greater harm than open neglect. The skin beneath the arms and along the chest grew red and infected. The cloth that once offered relief became a source of suffering. I cannot help but feel that each of those handkerchiefs carried the story of a woman too polite to care for herself. They absorbed more than sweat. They absorbed silence, expectation, and fear. Every stain was a record of endurance, every odour a confession that no one dared to make. They represented a kind of hygiene born from hypocrisy, one that valued appearance over health. By night, when the house grew quiet, women sometimes opened their pockets to air the clothes. The smell that escaped was sharp, like something old waking up. It filled the room briefly before sinking back into the fabric of the curtains and furniture. In that moment, the truth of their lives hung in the air, soft, sour, and unspoken. The handkerchiefs remained hidden by day, carried everywhere as proof of composure, yet inside them, decay travelled slowly, invisible but constant. Each one became a small monument to the absurdity of a society that feared cleanliness more than corruption. And as the years passed, the scent of these secret rags became the scent of the women themselves. It was not just on their clothes or in their homes, but in the very air that defined them. It lingered long after they were gone, like the faint echo of a whisper that no one wished to remember, but no one could forget. There were many ways a Victorian woman could be mistaken for dead, but few as cruel as the one caused by her own smell. In the dim rooms of that age, where illness and superstition walked hand in hand, the line between life and death blurred easily. People fainted often, their bodies weak from tight corsets, bad air, and a lack of food. When a woman collapsed and stopped moving, the stench that rose from her skin convinced others she had already passed. They said the smell was unmistakable, the same as a corpse left too long in summer air. It was not death that made her body reek, but life lived without cleansing, a slow decomposition mistaken for finality. The story of one girl was whispered through hospitals and parishes. She had fainted during a church service, collapsing among the benches. Those who rushed to help drew back almost immediately. The odour around her was unbearable, sharp and heavy like meat left in vinegar. Her skin was pale, her lips bluish, her chest still. The doctor declared her gone without much examination, for in that age smell was enough to speak of death. The body was placed in a shroud and carried away before sunset, but she was not dead. Beneath the layers of fabric, her chest rose faintly, unnoticed beneath the perfume of rot. She awoke in the cold of the mortuary, surrounded by silence. Her body trembled as she realized she could not move, wrapped tightly in linen. The sound of nails being driven into wood echoed somewhere near her feet. She screamed, but the sound was muffled by cloth and confusion. A worker heard a faint rustling and stopped. When the lid was opened, her eyes stared back, wide and terrified. The men stepped away in horror, thinking the dead had returned to life. The smell that filled the room was so foul that one of them vomited. Later, the newspapers described it as the scent of a soul reclaimed from decay. They did not understand that it was simply the odour of neglect that had festered too long. Such stories were not rare. Victorian hospitals were full of fainting women, their pulses slow and breaths shallow from years of physical restraint. Doctors called it hysteria, or weakness of the nerves. Few realized that the conditions of daily life, lack of bathing, poor air, starvation were what truly poisoned the body. When consciousness faded, the smell betrayed them. Families rushed to bury their loved ones quickly, fearful of disease spreading through the house. In their haste, they sometimes buried those who still clung to life. The grave became the last proof of how deeply ignorance could wound. Inside the homes of the poor, death was common and the smell of the body ordinary. Rooms rarely aired out. The scent of sweat, sickness, and mildew mixed into a single atmosphere that settled over everything. When someone fainted, there was no sharp distinction between living and dying. Both smelled the same. The neighbours gathered, whispering prayers, holding their noses. The same cloth used to wipe the face of the living might soon cover the face of the dead. It is haunting to think that a woman could live so poorly that her body became its own coffin long before she was buried. The upper classes were no safer. Their rooms were sealed, their clothing suffocating. Perfume covered decay but could not erase it. Doctors spoke of feminine vapours and delicate constitutions. inventing new ways to describe bodies slowly suffocating under their own vanity. The fainting fits that seemed so fashionable in novels were, in truth, collapses from exhaustion and infection. Women would lose consciousness for minutes or hours, their skin clammy and pale. In that stillness, surrounded by the scent of sweet powder and sweat turned sour, even their loved ones could not tell the difference between sleep and death. Some physicians began experimenting with new methods of confirming death, like mirrors placed near the mouth to detect breath. But such care was not always given to women, whose illnesses were dismissed as weakness. One doctor wrote that the scent alone speaks to the truth of mortality, believing that foulness meant finality. It was easier to believe that the body's stench proved death than to admit that it revealed neglect. If such things happened now, there would be outrage, yet back then, it was accepted as nature's quiet way of deciding who deserved to live. In mortuaries, workers developed their own rules. If a woman's body smelled strong enough to sting the eyes, they did not wait for further proof. The stench of rot, real or imagined, was a sign that the soul had left. The irony was cruel, for the smell came not from death but from the living flesh decaying under layers of filth. It was the odour of months without water, of corsets pressing sweat into skin, of dresses worn until they grew stiff with grime. When one worker remarked that some bodies smelled alive longer than they breathed, he did not realise how true his words were. The fear of being buried alive began to spread through Victorian society. Newspapers printed tales of people waking in their coffins, and readers shivered at the thought. Safety coffins were invented, equipped with bells or pipes to call for help if the buried stirred. Yet few asked why so many appeared dead while still breathing. The truth was simple and terrible. Their bodies had been starved of oxygen, compressed by clothing, and choked by their own waste until life and death looked and smelled the same. Women began to fear fainting itself, knowing what it could mean. They carried salts and perfumes, ready to revive themselves if they felt dizzy. But even those scents became corrupted, mixing with the odour of their own unwashed bodies into a heavy sweetness that made fainting more likely. The cycle continued, elegant and deadly. The air around them turned into their enemy, each breath a reminder of what they had become. I cannot shake the thought that the real tragedy was not being buried alive, but living as if already dead. Their skin no longer breathed, their lungs struggled beneath the weight of fabric and fear, and their scent announced their suffering before they could speak it. The world around them mistook that scent for death, not realizing it was only the natural perfume of a society rotting from its own denial. By night, when the houses fell silent and fires burned low, the smell lingered long after the bodies had gone to bed. It clung to pillows, to hair, to the corners of every room. It was a smell that told stories of women who had once been mistaken for corpses but were, in truth, only prisoners of their own customs. The line between living and the dead faded further with every generation. Some believed the odour of decay proved purity, a strange blend of morality and ignorance. They wore it like an invisible veil, proud and unaware, and in that confusion, some were taken from the world too soon, their lives sealed by the scent of their own endurance. They were not victims of misfortune, but of belief, buried under the weight of their own restraint. The air itself became their judge, the smell their verdict. The living world decided they belonged to the grave long before the earth ever touched them. The faint trace of rot in every home was more than just a smell. It was the signature of an era that confused suffering with virtue, and it was this confusion that would soon lead people to worship that very decay as proof of refinement and grace. Among all the parts of the body the Victorians feared to touch, none carried more shame than the one they used every day. The area that should have been washed most carefully was instead left untouched, hidden behind layers of moral silence. The belief was simple and cruel. To clean it was to be indecent. Women were taught from childhood that modesty ended where the body began, and that touching the lower parts of themselves was a sin of pride and impurity. So they did nothing. They endured the smell, the discomfort, and the infections, all in the name of virtue. What the body could have washed away easily with water became a daily wound buried under politeness. When a woman relieved herself, she did so quickly and in fear. Even the act was something to hide. Water was almost never used, for it was thought that washing could lead to illness or stir forbidden desires. Instead, she wiped with cloth, straw, or whatever rags were available, and often reused them. The residue clung to the fabric, then to her skin. It dried there, forming a rough layer that rubbed against the body each time she moved. The smell was strong enough to fill small rooms, though no one dared to mention it. It is chilling how easily shame can turn the simplest act of care into something forbidden. The result was constant irritation. The folds of the skin cracked and bled, while secretions and waste gathered over time. Infections spread quietly, beginning with mild itching and ending with abscesses that made sitting painful. Women who suffered from these ailments rarely sought help. To describe such a problem to a doctor was unthinkable. The Victorian woman was expected to be clean without ever appearing to clean herself. Her purity existed only in the imagination of those who never smelled the truth. In wealthier homes, perfumed powders were used in place of washing. Ladies would dust themselves after using the chamber pot, believing the scent would protect them from disease. The powders mixed with sweat and residue, creating a paste that burned the skin. The fabric of the undergarments, once white, turned grey and stiff from this mixture. Some women layered more perfume over the area, trapping the odour rather than removing it. Servants tasked with laundering such garments often held their breath as they worked. The smell of musk and waste was unmistakable, a scent that marked every corner of the laundry rooms of London. For the poor, there was no perfume, only endurance. They worked long hours and relieved themselves in shared spaces that offered neither privacy nor water. The same rags were used by several people, dried by the fire, and used again. The women wore their soiled underclothes for weeks, the fabric rubbing until sores appeared. Infections became part of life, spreading from one person to another, quietly ignored. The idea of washing seemed like a luxury. Dirt was not the exception. It was the condition of survival. Even in hospitals, this area was avoided. Nurses would change bandages, clean wounds, and feed patients, but they stopped short of washing what they called the unclean zone. Doctors refused to examine it unless the infection was visible from the outside. They wrote in their notes about strange odours of feminine origin, but rarely named the cause. A woman's body, in their view, was best treated without being truly seen. The result was years of medical silence. Patients died of infections that could have been prevented with a cup of warm water. If this happened today, people would call it neglect, but in that age, it was considered decency. The discomfort was constant. The smallest movement reminded women of what they tried to ignore. The fabric between their legs hardened with time, and each step made the rough edges scrape against their skin. Some used vinegar or spirits to wipe the area, thinking it would cleanse better than water. It did not. The liquid stung and left raw patches that became breeding grounds for bacteria. The pain became part of daily life, disguised under skirts and silence. The shame was powerful enough to outlive reason. Mothers passed it to daughters as a lesson in propriety. They warned them never to look or touch that place. The word itself was rarely spoken. A woman who cared too much about her body was seen as vain, and vanity was a moral failure. So they learned to sit still, to endure the smell, to fold their suffering into modesty. They did not know that what they called dignity was destroying their health one day at a time. In their homes, the air carried a faint sour note that mixed with coal and candle smoke. Visitors noticed but never spoke. The odour was considered part of womanhood, an unfortunate but natural condition. No one questioned it because no one dared to imagine the truth. The human body had become so entangled with morality that filth seemed virtuous. The very act of cleansing was seen as rebellion against decency. I think of how absurd it is that the act of washing, which should bring comfort, was treated as say-in while disease was allowed to grow in silence. Beneath the layers of lace and linen, women carried a pain that no one acknowledged. Their bodies, meant to be cared for, became symbols of restraint and denial. Each unwashed day deepened the divide between what they felt and what they were allowed to express. When night came, they lay still in their beds, the air heavy with the smell of trapped skin and dried waste. The fabric beneath them held the memory of every day that passed without cleansing. Even as they slept, the body continued to suffer quietly. The sores deepened, the rashes spread, and the infection crawled through the skin like something alive. They woke in the morning, dressed again, and repeated the same pattern, each day a small act of decay performed in silence. Their endurance was mistaken for virtue, and their pain for grace. The more they suffered, the more society praised them for being composed. No one dared to admit that the purity they worshipped was only rot in disguise. The smell that filled their rooms was not the scent of sin, but of neglect turned sacred. It clung to them through every season, unspoken but undeniable, as if the air itself carried judgment. It was the part of the body that the world refused to name, yet it carried the heaviest proof of what the era had done to women. The shame of touching it was so deep that even dying from it was preferable to admitting the need for water. And from that silence, new fears were born as infection and decay began to shape the way women thought about their own bodies. Victorian beauty was a mask carefully built to hide what life beneath it refused to heal. The women of that era painted their faces not to look beautiful, but to smell less human. Bathing was rare, and soap was expensive, so powders and perfumes became their daily salvation. Every morning, they stood before mirrors with trembling patience, brushing layers of white dust across their cheeks and forehead, pressing cold cream scented with violet or rose into the pores that had long forgotten fresh air. The result was a face that glowed faintly under candlelight, but suffocated beneath the weight of its own disguise. The powders were not gentle. They were made of lead, zinc, and crushed chalk. These substances clung to sweat, forming a crust that cracked with every expression. The skin underneath reddened, peeled, and then festered. Women dabbed more powder to cover the wounds, believing that beauty was a test of endurance. It is darkly amusing that the pursuit of purity made them dirtier than they ever dared to imagine. Each new layer trapped more of the body's natural oils and odours, sealing them under a sweet yet sour mixture that no amount of perfume could disguise. What began as an effort to hide became the reason they could no longer breathe freely. Perfume, once a symbol of elegance, became an act of survival. A woman could not enter public spaces without it. The air around her was a mix of musk, amber, sweat, and dust, a scent so thick it lingered after she left the room. The wealthy boasted of French imports in crystal bottles, while the poor settled for oils bought from street vendors, yet the effect was always the same. The body beneath remained unchanged, still unwashed, still decaying quietly under layers of silk. The perfume merely delayed the inevitable moment when the human smell would rise again. The powders clung not only to the skin but to the air itself. Rooms filled with women preparing for an evening shimmered with a pale mist of chemicals. The scent of lavender and lead mixed with candle smoke until breathing felt heavy. Some women fainted during these preparations, their lungs irritated by the fine dust that coated their throats. But fainting, too, was seen as a mark of refinement. To suffer for beauty was a virtue, not a warning. The face was only the beginning. Many also dusted their necks, shoulders, and even their arms, creating a full-body disguise. Each touch of powder left the skin drier, the pores more clogged. Underneath, sweat continued its work, trapped and unseen. By the end of the day, the once white powder turned grey, streaked with oil and grime. Still, they reapplied it before bed, believing the scent of flowers could calm them down. The irony was cruel. They dreamed surrounded by the very chemicals that were poisoning them. The poor had their own versions of this ritual. They mixed flour or rice powder with cheap perfume to mimic the look of the rich. These makeshift cosmetics hardened on the skin like plaster. When removed, if removed at all, they left the face raw and tender. Yet for one brief moment, under dim lamplight, they looked like the women in magazines, pale, fragile, and sickly enough to be considered beautiful. The illusion was powerful enough to forget the stench that waited beneath. Doctors began to notice strange conditions. Faces that cracked open like dry earth, rashes shaped like lace patterns, eyes swollen from constant irritation. They called it cosmetic disease. A few women stopped. To appear barefaced in public was more shameful than to be sick. The skin under the powder grew dull, lifeless, and discoloured. Some women described feeling their faces tighten as if the makeup itself had become a shell. When they smiled, the surface flaked away, exposing the truth for a moment before being covered again. If it happened now, it would be called poisoning, but then it was considered elegance. The society that feared water praised the art of disguise. Women who smelled strongly were told to wear more perfume, not to wash. The cycle continued until their faces became like theatre masks, beautiful at a distance and grotesque up close. No one dared to speak of the smell that rose from beneath the fragrance. The scent of flesh sealed too long from air. Perfume bottles decorated every vanity table. Some contained mixtures of animal fat and flowers that soured quickly in heat. The women dabbed them on their temples, wrists, and behind their ears, repeating the ritual with devotion. The scent lingered, but so did the sweat underneath. When 2 or 3 people gathered in a room, the combined odour was suffocating. It clung to curtains and gloves, soaked into velvet chairs, and hovered in the corners of mirrors. Servants described cleaning those rooms as walking through fog. The more they covered, the worse it became. Skin that could have healed with water grew brittle and inflamed. The pores tried to breathe but found only lead and oil blocking the way. Some women lost their eyebrows, others developed sores along the jawline. Yet they continued, driven by the unspoken rule that a proper woman must never smell like herself. To smell natural was to be vulgar. The air around them became an armour of perfume and powder, heavy enough to hide behind, yet fragile enough to crumble with a touch. I think the saddest part is that every layer of powder was a prayer for acceptance, whispered in silence to a world that never cared to listen. Behind the painted faces were women who had forgotten what clean skin felt like, whose pores had become prisons for the lives they could not live. The mirror reflected beauty, but the body beneath begged for air. At night, when the day's duties ended, they removed their jewellery but not their paint. The powder stayed, pressed deep into the pores, waiting for the next day's coat. Pillows turned pale with residue. Sheets carried the faint scent of roses mixed with human musk. The air in the room was sweet and heavy, too thick to breathe comfortably. And as they slept, their faces hardened in silence, a mask worn even in dreams. The morning light revealed the truth. Beneath the white dust, their skin was no longer skin, but a map of irritation and decay. The scent of perfume that once promised grace now mingled with something sour, something unmistakably human. It was the smell of beauty turned against itself, the price of silence painted in pale powder. The fragrance of their world was not flowers or soap, but the slow burn of bodies sealed under their own fear. It filled every street, every parlour, every breath they took. And from that scented silence, a new obsession was about to emerge, one that would take the same fear of impurity and push it even deeper into the body. It was perhaps the most dangerous ritual of all, born from desperation and ignorance. Some Victorian women, misled by false medical advice and superstition, believed that their wombs needed to be cleansed from within. Water was feared, and doctors offered little guidance beyond silence. So they took matters into their own trembling hands. Using instruments made of brass or copper, they tried to scrape away what they thought was impurity. The sound of metal against flesh was quiet but final. What began as an attempt to stay pure often ended in agony that no one dared to describe. The tools were crude, heated by candle flame or wiped with cloth. No one spoke of sterilization, and few understood infection. The instruments tore the delicate lining of the uterus, leaving raw wounds that festered unseen. Blood turned dark, fever rose, and yet these women endured, convinced that pain meant healing. It is horrifying how far modesty can push people from care into cruelty. Many of them never told anyone. They hid their suffering behind closed doors, whispering prayers through nights of pain until their bodies could no longer hold on. In diaries that survived, the words are spare and trembling. Some wrote of a burning within, others of a fever that will not cool. They believed they were removing dirt, but what they cleansed was life itself. Infection spread through the bloodstream, leading to convulsions, delirium, and death. The doctors who examined the bodies afterward often blamed childbirth or weak constitution. Few dared to say aloud what had really happened. The tools, when found, were small and rusted, wrapped in fabric and hidden among personal belongings. They were not instruments of medicine, but of fear. Mothers passed them to daughters with warnings that made no sense but carried the weight of centuries of silence. To touch one was to believe in cleanliness more than comfort, purity more than survival. These objects became secret relics of an age that worshipped suffering as virtue. Some women survived, but they did not escape unchanged. Their bodies bore scars, their health never returned, and their ability to bear children was often lost. Still, the practice continued in whispers, passed along in dark corners of dressing rooms and kitchens. Women shared tips on how to ease the pain, which oils might prevent fever, which prayers might soothe the soul. They did not know that each attempt was a step closer to the grave. In poor neighborhoods, midwives tried to help, though they, too, lacked the knowledge to do so safely. They boiled metal tools, rubbed them with wine or vinegar, and hoped for the best. When infection came, they used herbs to draw out the poison, but no herb could undo the damage already done. The pain became a kind of silence, one that spoke more about the cruelty of ignorance than any punishment could. The wealthy suffered differently. Their tools were finer, engraved with initials, polished to a shine. They came in velvet boxes labelled hygienic implements, sold discreetly in apothecaries. The same mistake was hidden behind lace and luxury. Their deaths, when they came, were described as mysterious fevers. No one connected them to the instruments still gleaming in their drawers. The fear of dirt had become greater than the fear of death. Women believed that their worth depended on staying clean inside and out, and since water could not reach them, metal would. Their world taught them that purity was everything and that the body was shameful, so they purified it until nothing was left. If it happened now, it would be called self-harm, but then it was seen as devotion. Each act of cleansing was a quiet confession of how deeply fear ruled their lives. They were victims of a system that told them to stay silent and pure even as it killed them. The scent of iron and blood that filled their rooms was not just the smell of death, but of an era bleeding from its own beliefs. Their suffering was not a mystery. It was the logical end of a world that punished women for being flesh and blood. By the end of the century, some doctors began to speak out. They called for education, for proper washing, for understanding the body as something living rather than shameful. But the damage had already been done. Countless women had died nameless deaths, their stories buried along with their bodies. The instruments were thrown away or forgotten, and history covered them with the same silence that had once surrounded their lives. I think what lingers most is not the horror of what they did, but the loneliness that led them there. Every cut, every fever, Every whispered secret was a reminder that they had no one to turn to. They were surrounded by people who praised their modesty while ignoring their pain. Their deaths were not accidents. They were the final lesson of a world that feared the truth of being human. The smell of brass and blood faded from the air, but the echoes of their suffering remained. It became part of history's quiet shame, the chapter no one wished to open. In the silence left behind, their voices still wait, soft and invisible, asking to be understood rather than pitied. They did not need purity. They needed compassion. They needed the freedom to touch, to wash, to live without fear of what was natural. But the world offered them metal instead of mercy. And so the story of their suffering ends here, in the stillness where the air feels cleaner only because those who breathed it are gone. May it remind us that what people call decency can sometimes be the cruelest form of neglect. Now, close your eyes, let the noise of the past grow quiet, let the cold rooms, the whispers, and the smell of lead and perfume fade into darkness. You're safe now, far from that time, far from their pain. Sleep softly, and may your dreams stay clean.